They say the garden is a place of peace. But behind every rose lies a thorn, and behind every hedge, a secret. Welcome to Infidelity Chronicles, where passion, betrayal, and mystery intertwine beneath the surface of manicured lawns and ivy-covered walls. Over 10 unforgettable stories, we follow the footsteps of a man who is never just a gardener, and the women who welcome him into their lives. And sometimes, into the destruction. From whispered affairs in sun-drenched villas to echoes of past lives uncovered in forgotten portraits. Each tale reveals how one quiet presence can unravel everything. He tended their gardens, but he also unearthed their guilt, their longing, and in some cases, their ghosts. This is the Gardener series, 10 stories, 10 secrets, and not all of them are buried. It was late spring when the new gardener arrived at the Greenwich estate. The magnolias were in bloom. The air carried the sweet tang of cut grass and lavender, and Laura found herself more alone than she had ever felt in her 17 years of marriage. The estate spanned 5 hectares of carefully designed wilderness, yet it felt more like a gilded cage than a home. Her husband, Paul Greenwich, real estate magnate and tabloid darling, was away once again, this time on what he called a damage control tour, following a scandal involving offshore accounts, a missing CEO, and a suspicious Cayman transaction. Paul hadn't touched her in months. Even his voice over the phone had lost its warmth, as if the legal firestorm had scorched even his ability to feign affection. Laura had grown used to the solitude. Her days blurred into wine-stained afternoons on the terrace, her nights punctuated by the sterile silence of a marital bed untouched. Then, one morning, a man appeared among the hedges, Marco. He didn't knock, he didn't need to, the agency had sent him. And apparently, Paul had approved the hiring without consulting her. Typical. Marco was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin tanned from labor. His posture relaxed but alert. His hair was tousled, but not unkempt, and there was a crescent-shaped scar at the nape of his neck that drew her attention for reasons she couldn't explain. He wore dark green overalls and leather gloves, and he moved through the garden as if it were not a place to work, but a space to listen. Laura watched him from her bedroom window at first. It was innocent, at least that's what she told herself. She noted how he kneeled to touch the soil with the reverence of a monk. How he paused before cutting each branch, as though asking permission. She noticed he didn't wear earbuds like the last one. He wasn't distracting himself. He was present, entirely present, and maddeningly silent. The silence drew her in. He never initiated conversation, but when she brought him lemonade on the 3rd day, he nodded politely and said, "Gracie, just that." His voice was deep but soft, textured like gravel under silk. She smiled more than she should have. She returned to the window more often than she admitted. Soon, it wasn't just watching, it was observing. Anticipating, obsessing. Then came the moment, one of those summer days where the wind barely moves and time seems caught in amber. Laura had chosen a thin white dress, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps not. She wandered into the garden, her sandals leaving trails in the dew-flecked grass. Marco was trimming a row of yellow daisies. He didn't look up at first. Then he did, slowly. Their eyes met, not in the clumsy, startled way of strangers, but in a long, measured silence that curled around them like smoke. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, he only looked. And then, in a voice so calm it felt rehearsed, he said, "Sunflowers don't face the sun when it deceives them." Laura stood frozen. There was no metaphor he could have chosen that would strike closer to the truth of her life. Paul, once her son, had become a cold, distant thing, brilliant from afar, but utterly incapable of warmth. She felt heat rise to her face. Embarrassment, desire, anger, maybe all of them. She turned without answering, her fingers clenched, her pulse a drumline beneath her skin. That night, the estate felt different. She poured herself a glass of Merlot, but didn't finish it. Something nagged at her, the way Marco looked at her, the way he moved, the way he knew. She opened the security app on her phone, habitual, casual. Then she paused. The feed from camera 7, overlooking the rose archway, caught something odd. Marco, shirtless under moonlight, standing still, looking up at the second-floor window. Her window, at the exact moment she had undressed. She leaned closer to the screen, heart in her throat. It could be coincidence, or instinct, or something else, something watching, something waiting. Laura locked her phone, but couldn't lock away the thoughts. She lay awake long into the night, imagining hands that smelled of soil and lavender brushing her skin. She didn't know what Marco was hiding, but she knew he was hiding something. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone, she felt alive. Laura found the roses just after sunrise. She opened the French doors to let the morning air into the kitchen and nearly tripped over them, 12 blood-red blooms. Dewy and fragrant, nestled in a weather-worn gardener's boot. There was no note, no ribbon, no name, just the unmistakable scent of intention. It sat there like a secret, waiting to be noticed. She looked toward the garden. Marco was already at work, as if he had never left. The rhythmic sound of hedge shears punctuated the silence. Precise and deliberate. He didn't look up, he didn't wave, but Laura knew. She didn't know how, she just did. Since that night, the moonlight, the camera, the look, something had shifted. Not in the garden, but in her. She found herself orchestrating chance encounters. A lost earring near the orchid beds. A spontaneous craving for lemonade delivered just as he paused under the shade. A careless movement by the rose bush that left her finger bleeding from a thorn. That day, she had knelt beside the flower bed in her silk robe, pretending to inspect soil she didn't understand. When she winced, Marco appeared, quiet, immediate. He reached for her hand without a word, pressed a clean cloth to the wound. His fingers were warm, calloused, steady. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met again. His were the color of dried tobacco and stone, deep-set and unreadable. But in that instant, she saw something flicker, regret, restraint, recognition. Then he turned away, muttered, "Be careful," and vanished into the greenhouse like mist retreating from heat. That night, the house was alive with music. Paul hosted a gathering of his elite, congressmen, venture capitalists, influencers who called themselves philanthropists. Laura wore the diamond choker he'd gifted her last winter, though he hadn't looked at her long enough to notice. By 10 o'clock, she'd slipped outside, barefoot and bored, lighting a cigarette she didn't need. The moon hung low, smeared behind clouds like a wound. Near the tool shed, she saw him, Marco, shirt half unbuttoned, wiping sweat from his neck with the back of his hand. The glow of a single lantern danced across his collarbones. She stepped closer. Neither spoke. When they kissed, it was not cinematic. It was restrained, urgent, unfinished, a fire smothered before it burned. Their lips met like a confession no one was ready to write. And when it ended, they didn't say goodbye. They walked in opposite directions like strangers leaving a crime scene. The next morning, the sky was the color of wet ash. Laura brewed coffee she didn't drink and waited for him to look up. He didn't. He mowed the lawn with mechanical focus. His back turned, his movements exacting and impersonal. It was as if the kiss had never happened. As if she had imagined it all. The silence became unbearable. She called the landscaping agency pretending to request a copy of his employment file. What she received was a single-page form, no address, no emergency contact, no previous employers. A photo, yes, but no fingerprints. Nothing. Marco, it seemed, had appeared out of nowhere and grown roots overnight. That night, she dreamt of fire. She was running barefoot through a burning meadow, calling his name, unable to find him. The smoke stung her eyes. She tripped over something, a shovel, maybe, and as she fell, she saw him, watching from the other side of the flames. In the days that followed, Laura began to unravel. She asked him questions he never answered. She lingered in hallways, hoping to hear his footsteps. One afternoon, while he was trimming a line of rosemary, she whispered, "Do you believe in leaving everything behind?" Marco looked at her, not with surprise, but with that same quiet stillness. Then he smiled, small, cryptic, and went back to his work. Laura knew she had crossed a threshold. The estate no longer felt like a prison, it felt like a stage. Every hallway, every hedge, every shadow was part of a play only she and Marco could see. She sent her daughter to her mother's house, claiming allergies, the air, the isolation, anything that would make the lie sound maternal. For the first time in years, the estate was hers alone, hers and his. That evening, she walked past the greenhouse. A single slip of paper sat tucked between the slats of the bench where she'd once seen him reading plant journals in Italian. Written in a bold, precise hand, "If you truly want to disappear, meet me after sunset." No name, no time, just a truth Laura could no longer deny. Temptation, she realized, does not shout, it whispers, and she was already listening. Laura hadn't meant to follow him. She told herself she was simply walking, stretching her legs, admiring the azaleas, but when she saw Marco enter the greenhouse with a thick roll of parchment tucked under his arm, curiosity pulled her toward the glass like gravity. The inside of the greenhouse shimmered in the golden light of late afternoon. Laura moved quietly, careful not to step on the cracked stone tiles or jostle the empty terracotta pots. Through the panes of glass clouded by condensation, she saw him crouched over a low wooden table, unrolling the parchment. It wasn't a plant journal. It was a blueprint. She couldn't make out all the details from the doorway, but the lines were unmistakable. Schematics of the estate, the sloping contours of the land, the access points to irrigation, and in the lower left corner, a handwritten label, "Sub-drain system, Greenwich residence." Her breath caught. She stepped back, heart pounding, before he could see her. She waited in the shadows, her thoughts racing. Why would a gardener need a drainage schematic? Why draw escape routes? Unless she didn't confront him that day. Instead, she waited. The next evening, just before twilight, she found him in the old equipment shed behind the west hedgerow. It was where unused furniture went to die, wrought iron chairs with broken legs, cracked marble planters, a dusty brass telescope no one had touched in years. Marco was waiting. No lanterns, no words, just the scent of cedar and rust. When they kissed this time, it wasn't hesitant. There was no restraint, no shame, only hunger, the kind that comes not from the body, but from the ache of being unseen for too long. His hands found her waist. Her nails traced the scar at the back of his neck. Time slowed. Breathing deepened. The world outside shrank until it was only skin, silence, and the shared pulse of desperation. Later, as they sat on a wooden bench beneath a tarp-covered statue, Laura asked, "Who are you really?" Marco stared into the dark for a long moment, then exhaled. "Once," he said, "I was a soldier. Italy, the Navy, did things I don't talk about. Lost people, then I lost myself, so I disappeared. Gardens make sense. Everything grows if you stop trying to control it." She listened, silently. He wasn't giving her facts, he was giving her permission to believe in reinvention. "Paul used to tell me I was a prize," she said, "a trophy, a symbol of his success. Sometimes I feel like the most expensive thing he owns." Marco didn't respond. He didn't need to. That week, they began planning, not in whispers, but in glances, not in meetings, but in touches. Laura bought 2 prepaid phones at a gas station outside town. They exchanged numbers without names. Marco used black electrical tape to obscure the phone logos. They deleted messages daily, spoke in code. She called him, August. He called her, Elm. On Thursday, she transferred $300 into a hidden account, offshore. Cayman. She told herself it wasn't running away. It was investing in possibility. "We burn everything," Marco told her as they walked beneath the weeping willows. "Letters, journals, traces. If it matters, we carry it. If it doesn't, we bury it." She spent hours one night tearing out pages from her diaries. She burned wedding photos in the fire pit by the pool. The flames danced, reflected in her glass of whiskey, in her eyes. Then Paul came home. He wasn't supposed to. The schedule had said Zurich. A conference, a board meeting, but late Friday morning, The front gates creaked open and the Bentley glided in like a spectre returning to haunt. Laura barely had time to hide the burner phone under the drawer lining. She found Marco near the maintenance shed, handed him the universal keycard without speaking. He vanished. She watched from the sunroom as he climbed into the hollow of the pool filter room, a space no one ever checked. That night, Paul drank 2 whiskeys without offering her one. He scrolled his phone, muttered things under his breath. She saw a glimpse of a name, Panama, before he turned the screen. She waited until he slept, then reviewed the security footage. Camera 2, near the wine cellar stairwell, had picked up his voice. "I said clear the shipment before Monday. We've held the shell companies long enough." Her blood turned cold. She pressed pause, stared at his frozen image on screen. The man who built towers, cut deals, smiled for magazines, now spoke in code about shipments and shells and clearance. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation. And suddenly, Marco wasn't just an escape. He was an answer. Friday night arrived heavy with thunderclouds. Laura packed light. A single duffel bag, cash, passport, a single necklace, her mother's. She wore black, not for stealth, for clarity, for mourning what she once called a life. The clock struck 10. She slipped through the side door, past the gardenias, down the path of moss-covered stones that led to the great oaks. They stood like silent witnesses, waiting, and so was she, waiting for Marco, waiting for the promise of elsewhere. The night air was warm but restless, thick with the kind of humidity that makes shadows feel heavier. Laura stood beneath the oak trees in her black dress, the duffel bag by her feet, her pulse a steady echo in her ears. Every sound, the creak of branches, the chirp of crickets, felt amplified, as though the night itself were holding its breath. She checked her phone for the 3rd time in as many minutes. No messages, no signal, the screen blinked to hollow, no service. She looked toward the greenhouse. Nothing. Toward the tool shed. Nothing. Toward the gravel road where headlights should have appeared by now. Nothing. Her breath shortened. He was late. 15 minutes. Then 20. She told herself he was being careful, that something must have delayed him. Security guards. Timing. The weather. But a different voice inside her. One she hadn't heard since she was a child left waiting on a rainy curb after ballet class. Whispered the word, abandoned. She walked in small, frantic circles beneath the trees, her heels sinking into the damp earth. Then, as if triggered by her movement, the motion-activated floodlights along the south wing burst to life. A moment later, the sirens came. Laura froze. Red and blue lights tore through the night like ruptured veins, flooding the estate's winding drive. The gates had opened, automatically, remotely. 2 black SUVs. Matte finish. Government plates. No screeching tires. Just purpose. Precision. Men in dark uniforms moved like liquid. Fast and practiced. She ran. Not far. Just across the grass. Back to the kitchen door. Heart hammering so loud it drowned out reason. Her hands shook as she keyed in the override code. The lock beeped. The door opened. She stumbled inside. Bolted it shut. She grabbed her phone again. Still no signal. She checked the home security app. Flipping through camera feeds, everything looked normal. Garden empty. Driveway bright but still. But then she noticed it. Camera 4, offline. Camera 6, glitching. A 2-hour gap in the recording from earlier that evening. Deliberate. Clean. Someone had tampered with the system. She rushed to the upstairs bedroom. The duffel bag still clutched to her chest. And opened the fireplace. Inside, behind a loose brick, were the final papers she hadn't burned, old letters. Backup IDs. The list of account numbers. She reached for the lighter when the banging started. FBI, open the door. Laura froze again, not with shock, with a sick, spreading understanding. The door burst open moments later. Tactical boots pounded marble. Shouts. Flashlights. She backed against the wall. Both hands raised. Mom, step away from the bag. Hands where we can see them. Wait, she gasped. Wait, I didn't. This isn't what you think. "You're Laura Greenwich." "Yes, but I don't know what's going on. I swear." One agent stepped forward, blonde buzzcut, clipboard, cold eyes. "You are under investigation for conspiracy to launder funds, aiding in fraudulent asset transfers, and obstruction of a federal investigation." "I didn't," her voice cracked. "I didn't do anything, I was trying to get away." The agent didn't blink. He turned toward a technician behind him. "Roll it." A portable projector hummed to life. On the wall of her bedroom, once covered in gauzy curtains and wedding photos, now flickered a grainy black and white video. Marco, at Paul's office, at the safe, extracting folders, plugging in a USB, snapping photos of documents, calm, efficient, practiced. Laura stepped back, one hand covering her mouth. "That's not possible," she whispered. "He said he was." "Marco isn't Marco," said the agent. "His real name is Michael Reeve. He's a federal operative." Laura blinked. The name meant nothing, and yet, it shattered everything. The projector clicked to the next video. Michael, speaking to her in the greenhouse. Talking about burning evidence, speaking in code, planning, recorded audio, clean and crisp, taken from a microphone hidden in the bench. "Every word you said to him," the agent explained, "was monitored. Every promise, every plan." She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as though her ribs were collapsing inward. And then Paul walked in. Uncuffed, unbothered, unapologetic. He adjusted his tie, looked around as if mildly inconvenienced by the mess. "I see it went smoothly," he said. Laura stared at him. Her voice returned in a whisper. "You knew." Paul met her eyes, his own devoid of warmth. "Of course I knew. You set me up." He tilted his head slightly. "I protected my assets." The room spun. The betrayal wasn't just from Michael, but from the man who had once vowed to love her forever. And it had been planned. Every step, every kiss, every moment beneath the lavender and the stars. Choreographed. "Why?" she asked, tears finally falling. "Why me?" "Because," Paul said simply, "we knew someone in my circle was leaking intel. I just didn't expect it to be you." She shook her head. "I wasn't. I never was." "No," he said, "but we needed to be sure." The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. As she was led away, past the portraits and the roses and the hollow echo of everything she'd tried to escape, she looked back one last time. Not at Paul, but at the shadow in the hallway. The man with the scar at his neck. Watching, not with pity, not with guilt, with nothing. Michael Reeve did not flinch. He had done his job. And Laura had nowhere left to run. The cell was colder than she expected, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Concrete floors that smelled faintly of bleach and despair. Iron bars that rattled even when no one touched them. Laura Greenwich, once the queen of charity galas and hedge fund banquets, now sat on a metal cot beneath fluorescent lights that never fully slept. The trial hadn't started. It would be months before the court assembled all its layers of accusations, evidence, statements, but for now, she was held without bail, deemed a flight risk, a woman too skilled at vanishing into the folds of money. The press had not been kind. They never were, especially to beautiful women who fell. Tabloids called her the Garden Jezebel. Online forums labeled her the Madam of Dirty Roots. But the one that stuck, the one that trended for weeks, was the Queen of Thorns. A viral photo showed her being led away in cuffs, her hair wild in the wind, roses blooming wildly in the background like a cruel joke. Laura had stopped reading the papers. Her lawyer, a kindly man with tired eyes and neatly ironed cuffs, tried to prepare her for what lay ahead. "They want to make an example of you," he said. "You're the headline, not the crime." She nodded. She no longer cried during these meetings. But she always asked one thing: "Have you found out anything about Marco?" The answer never changed. "His file is sealed, top level. I'm not even allowed to confirm that he exists." Michael Reeve, whatever his real name was. It echoed in her like an unfinished song. She didn't hate him, that would have been easier. Hatred is clean, but what she felt was messier, grief, disbelief, an ache that she'd given something real to someone who never was. In a letter she asked her lawyer to deliver, never to be sent. Only to be read if needed, she wrote, "I do not regret loving him. I regret believing he was real." The days in prison blurred. She avoided other inmates. She tended to the small patch of weeds outside her unit, pulling them not because she had to, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. Then one morning, a guard handed her a package. A small ceramic pot. Inside, a blooming purple orchid. Healthy, impossibly perfect, and beneath the pot's moss lining, a single seed, sealed in a tiny envelope. Handwritten in ink she recognized. No name, just one line. "I never lied, I only chose truth over love." Her fingers trembled. She asked the guard who sent it. He shrugged, said it was dropped off by a visitor who gave no name and left no ID. The next morning, the orchid was gone, not taken officially. It simply vanished. When she asked the guard again, he looked confused, claimed he'd never seen it. Laura said nothing. Outside, the news rolled on. Paul had returned to the spotlight, arm in arm with a new fiancée. Younger, blonder, more pliable, he gave interviews, donated to environmental causes, smiled on magazine covers. The world forgave him, as it always did for men who made money. Of Marco, there was no trace, no mention, no photo, just silence, as though he had been a fever dream conjured by desperation. When the sentencing came, Laura wore navy blue. She stood tall. She did not cry. 5 years, white-collar facility, probation after 3. In the prison garden, a narrow courtyard lined with dying shrubs. She knelt one morning beside the hard soil and pressed a seed into the earth. Her fingers dirtied, her breath slow. She whispered to no one, "If you're out there, let it bloom." She watered it daily. The guards thought she was mad. Her fellow inmates rolled their eyes. But she didn't stop. Weeks passed. A sprout emerged, a thin, tentative green. And one day, she looked up. A new groundskeeper had been assigned to the prison. Young, clean-shaven, baseball cap pulled low. He moved differently than the others, quieter, more careful. He didn't look at her directly, just nodded once as he passed. But Laura saw the scar. A small crescent, just at the base of his neck. She smiled. Not wide, not hopeful, just enough. Because sometimes, the last flower doesn't bloom for the world. Sometimes, it blooms for the one who never stopped believing it might. Ethan brushed his gloved hand over the soil, the back of his neck damp with sweat despite the crisp mountain air. It was his second week at Bell Hall, and something about the ground beneath this particular rose bush made him pause. The earth was looser here, darker, as if it had been recently disturbed and then hastily packed again. He pushed the spade deeper and struck something hard, not rock. Hollow, metallic. Slowly, carefully, he dug around it. What emerged was a rusted garden rake, half buried, the handle worn smooth by time, the metal curled and brittle. It looked decades old, forgotten, yet oddly out of place, as if it had been left there not by accident, but as a quiet mark of something no one wanted remembered. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stood, casting his eyes across the sprawling, overgrown garden. Bell Hall sat high on the hill, its wrought iron gates always closed, its hedgerows tall enough to muffle sound. The estate was beautiful, certainly, but it held a kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, watching. Ethan was 29, raised in Vermont, trained in horticulture in Tuscany. He had come to Bell Hall for solitude. And maybe, unconsciously, for reinvention. The job ad had been terse, live-in gardener needed, privacy valued. That was it, but the pay was good. And he needed the break. Bell, the owner, met him on the first day with a glass of wine in one hand and a pair of pruning shears in the other. She was striking, mid-40s. Dark auburn hair in a loose braid. Green eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. She carried herself like a woman used to being watched. And bored of it. "My husband passed," she said simply, 8 months ago. Heart failure. He didn't care for gardens. There were no children, no siblings, no daily staff, only a housekeeper who came twice a week and left before sunset. The rest of the time, Belle lived alone among the memories of someone she never spoke much about. Ethan found that curious. The house bore no signs of grief, no shrines, no untouched clothing, no signs of mourning, just that lush, wild garden wrapping itself around Belle Hall like ivy around a throat. He threw himself into the work, weeding, restoring stone paths, pruning overgrown shrubs that hadn't seen care in years. But everywhere he went, the soil felt wrong. Not dead, on the contrary. It was rich, damp, fertile, but too much so, as if it had been fed. Belle began to appear more often around dusk. She would come down barefoot, a shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, always holding a glass of wine that never emptied. Her voice was velvet, slow, slightly slurred, not with drunkenness, but with memory. "You're making it beautiful again," she said once, watching him plant new lavender. "I had forgotten what that feels like." He thanked her politely, kept his eyes on the soil, but something in her gaze lingered. It wasn't just admiration, it was hunger, not for him, necessarily, but for something deeper, something to anchor her. He caught himself watching her, too, despite the age gap, despite the circumstances. There was something magnetic about her sadness. She didn't cry, she didn't break, she drifted, like smoke from an unseen fire. One evening, as the sun slid behind the pines and cast long shadows across the lawn, Belle walked up beside him. He was kneeling by a patch of peonies, trimming deadheads. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, softly, "Do you believe this place was once a Garden of Eden?" He looked up, one brow raised. Her face was unreadable. "If it was," he said, smiling faintly, "there were definitely a few snakes hiding in the trees." She laughed, a low, amused sound. It didn't reach her eyes. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The silence of Belle Hall had shifted, turned heavy, humid. He tossed beneath the thin sheets, the image of Belle's face behind his eyes. Just as he began to doze, the dream took him. He stood in the garden, barefoot, the air thick and warm. A figure emerged from the far end, a man, older, with a torn dressing robe, dried blood at the collarbone. His skin was gray, his eyes wide. He pointed at Ethan, spoke in a rasp that seemed to come from the soil itself. "She'll plant you too." Ethan woke with a start. Sweat soaked his shirt, the scent of roses clung to his sheets. Outside, the garden waited, and somewhere beneath it, something else waited too. Belle began appearing more often. It wasn't subtle, she made herself known, not with noise, but with presence. When Ethan worked beneath the arbor, she arrived barefoot, in flowing silk gowns that blurred the line between sleepwear and seduction. Her hair, always slightly damp at the ends, hung loose over her shoulders like ivy cascading from a forgotten wall. She never wore perfume, yet the scent of lilac and wine clung to her as though the house itself had exhaled her into the garden. She brought 2 glasses each time, one for herself, one for him. She would sip slowly, watching him from the wrought iron bench beneath the wisteria vines, saying little unless prompted. Her silences weren't awkward, they were curated, designed to make you want to fill them. And when she finally spoke, her words floated like dust motes through golden light, half confessional, half incantation. "My husband," she said once, swirling her wine in slow, hypnotic circles, "hated this garden. He said flowers were a waste of land. He liked cement, control." Ethan paused his raking, unsure if he should respond. Belle didn't seem to expect anything. She told stories not for comfort or catharsis, but to disrupt the silence that had grown too still, too deep. Her voice carried no sadness, only a resigned amusement, as if she had lived too long with ghosts to fear them anymore. "He was much older than me," she continued, "inherited his money, inherited his anger, too, I think. He didn't believe in softness, or seasons. Everything had to stay the same, forever." Ethan nodded politely, unsure what to do with the intimacy she offered so freely. There was no sorrow in her voice. Just the cold clarity of someone who had turned pain into ritual. Still, he found himself thinking of her long after she drifted back into the house. He began to see the garden not just as overgrowth to tame, but as something sacred, an extension of her moods, her wounds. Every rose he pruned, every creeping vine he retrained, felt like a small offering, a way of saying, I see what you survived. And she noticed. One late afternoon, while he was skimming algae from the koi pond, Belle appeared with a folded parchment in her hand. No words, just a soft gaze, and the paper passed into his palm. It was a sketch of the garden redrawn. New paths, hidden benches, arches wrapped in climbing roses. At the bottom, in ink delicate as breath, it read, "For the man who brought it back to life." She vanished before he could reply. That night, she invited him to the greenhouse. He stood at the threshold for a long moment. The glass was fogged from warmth and candlelight. Shadows moved like living things against the walls, vines twisting, flames flickering. When he stepped inside, the air was thick, pulsing with scent, damp earth, overripe figs, something floral and faintly sweet, almost medicinal. Candles ringed the space in a soft circle. It wasn't romantic. It was ceremonial. At the center, Belle sat on a low ottoman, her robe draped around her like smoke. A bottle of Cabernet open beside her, a platter of fruit untouched. She didn't speak, she only watched. When she rose, her movements were slow, not calculated, but reverent, as if she were approaching something sacred. Ethan stood still. He could have turned back, could have broken the spell, but he didn't. Their night together unfolded like a forgotten song, quiet, aching, laced with memory neither of them had lived, but both recognized. Her fingers traced his ribs like counting scars. His hands held her as if fearing she would disappear at dawn. No words passed, only breath, and time. In the morning, Belle said nothing. She didn't meet his eyes, only brushed her fingers across his shoulder as he laced his boots. And whispered, "Bring everything back to life. Even me." He went to the rose garden. He worked harder than before, as though something inside him had broken loose and needed anchoring. The roses were tangled, dying, forgotten. He dug into their roots, charted new spaces, checked moisture levels, followed the blueprint she'd drawn. The third bush was stubborn. The soil clung to the shovel too tightly. Deeper, wetter, off in texture. When the blade struck something solid, he expected stone, but this wasn't stone. It yielded with a sickening give. Hollow, wrong. He crouched, brushed the soil away with his gloves. What he unearthed was curved, pale, unmistakably organic. A femur, long and smooth, weathered by time. Clinging to it, a shred of navy cotton, pajama fabric. He recoiled, heart racing, dropped the bone, stumbled backward into the dirt. In the silence, Belle's voice whispered back to him, not from memory, but from marrow, "You're the beginning, Ethan, not the end." The house loomed behind him, its windows wide and expressionless. The garden held its breath. And somewhere inside the soil, other roots stirred. Ethan wrapped the bone fragment in an old cloth, folding it carefully before slipping it into the bottom of his satchel. His hands shook, not with fear, at least not yet, but with the dawning weight of implication. The ground hadn't lied, something had been buried there. And not something small. He didn't go back to the house. Not right away. Instead, he walked briskly down the gravel path toward his truck parked beyond the south gate. The sun was high and sharp, but the air felt weighted, like the sky had thickened with something unspeakable. He turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't even cough. Frowning, he stepped out and circled the vehicle. The rear tire was flat. Not a leak. Slashed. He looked around. No one. Just the rustle of leaves. Birds gone quiet. He pulled out his phone, hands already dialing the local sheriff's number, but there was no service. 0 bars. He walked closer to the main house, hoping for Wi-Fi. Still nothing. The router's signal, which usually blinked green from the front parlor, was now dark. That was when he heard her voice. "Did you find something interesting, Ethan?" He turned. Belle stood just behind him, one hand on the porch railing, a glass of wine already in the other despite the hour. She was barefoot again, her dress a shade of ivory that turned translucent in the sun. Her smile was soft, curious, timeless. Ethan forced a breath. "Just digging, old soil." She hummed, stepping closer. "Funny what the earth holds on to." She gestured toward the door. "Come inside. It's too hot to pretend we're not thirsty." He hesitated, then followed. Inside, everything was cooler, dimmer, curtains drawn just enough to let in gold-streaked shadows. She poured 2 glasses of wine and led him to the dining room, where the table had already been set for 2. He hadn't noticed when she had time to prepare it. Roasted lamb, figs, crusty bread, a wedge of cheese sweating in the warmth. "Do you believe," she said, cutting into the lamb with practiced ease, "that some flowers need blood to bloom?" Ethan paused, fork in hand. She smiled, chewing slowly. "Just something I read once." The conversation moved like mist, never quite settling on anything. Belle spoke of books she hadn't finished, travels she might have taken, paintings that once hung in the house but had since disappeared. Her tone was dreamy, lilting, as though the present were only a whisper between memories. That night, after she retreated to her wing, Ethan went to the old study at the end of the east corridor. The door creaked when he opened it, revealing a room cloaked in dust and old paper. Shelves sagged under the weight of yellowing ledgers and journals. One, in particular, caught his eye, small, leather-bound, tied shut with brittle twine. Inside were pages written in a tight, angular hand. The entries were dated from a year ago, the last year of Belle's husband. Ethan read, "She watches me in the garden. I don't sleep anymore. There are things missing. Books, bank slips, my pills. She says the vines grow faster when I'm angry. The roses like my blood. If something happens to me, dig beneath the 3rd bush. The one that never dies." Ethan closed the journal with trembling fingers. The urge to run clawed at his spine. He grabbed his bag, rushed to the truck, and tried to start it again out of sheer desperation. Still dead. He circled the back of the estate, past the greenhouses, toward the outer fence. It was chained, not just locked, but bolted with fresh iron links, as though someone knew he might try. He slept in the greenhouse, not out of comfort, but because it was the only place with glass walls, where nothing could hide. He placed the wrapped bone beneath his head like a relic, or a warning. His fingers clutched it even in sleep. And sleep did come, but not peace. In the dream, the man returned, the one in the robe. Only this time, he reached for Ethan, his hands cold and slick, as though pulled from deep earth. Blood ran from his eyes like tears. "She planted me," he whispered, voice cracked and full of rot. Then he smiled. "And now she's planting you." Ethan awoke to the thick scent of damp soil and something sweeter, rotting petals, crushed stems, the breath of 1,000 living things held captive beneath glass. The air clung to his skin, heavy and humid. He tried to move but found his arms bound tightly to the sides of a wrought iron chair. The metal was cold, the bindings were rough twine, biting into his wrists and ankles. He blinked, disoriented. All around him, the greenhouse bloomed in chaos. Ferns curled over broken pots. Orchids spilled from hanging baskets. Vines grew rampant, twisting like veins. It was no longer a garden. It was a jungle with a pulse. And in the center of it all stood Belle. She wore black, a dress of silk so dark it caught no light, only shadow. Her bare feet made no sound as she moved, ghost-like, through the foliage. In her hand, a single glass of wine, deep red. Too rich to be anything but ominous. "I didn't want it this way," she said, voice calm, almost mournful, "but beauty asks for sacrifice." Ethan struggled against the twine. "Belle, please, don't beg," she interrupted gently. "It ruins the dignity. You've seen the garden. You know what it demands." He shook his head, panic mounting. "I won't say anything. I swear to you. I'll leave. I'll disappear." She tilted her head, studying him like one of her roses under threat of pruning. "They all say that," she said, right before they vanish. She stepped closer, kneeling beside a nearby planter. From behind a sack of mulch, she pulled a small cloth pouch. She untied it slowly, delicately, as if performing a ritual she knew by heart. Inside, fragments of broken glass, twisted metal, and what looked like the shattered face of a wristwatch. Ethan's stomach dropped. She held up the largest shard, watching it catch the dim light. "This was Martin's," she said. "He never took it off. Not even when he slept. But plants don't need time. They need blood and patience." Ethan's breath came fast. He remembered the bone, the journal, the dream, the cold hands pulling him down. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. Belle's eyes softened, but not with pity, with reverence. "I do," she said. "The garden is alive because of what it's been given. You felt it, didn't you? You made it bloom." He shook his head. "It's madness. It's legacy." She moved behind him. He heard the sound of a syringe, metal clinking against glass. The hiss of liquid drawn. He bucked against the chair, kicked out blindly. She was unfazed. "If you love me," she said, "you'll understand. You won't betray what we built." Her voice had changed. It was no longer soft. It was the voice of roots cracking stone. The needle slid into his neck. Cold fire spread through his veins. His last vision before the darkness took him was of Belle lifting a small trowel, her eyes shining with something close to joy. In the slow bleed of dawn, Belle stood in the garden with a shovel. Her movements were steady, practiced. She dug beneath the third rose bush, the one that always bloomed redder than the others. When the hole was finished, she gently placed a single tag beside the base of the plant. It was handmade, ink on soft wood, tied with a string of black ribbon. "Rosa Ethan," and for the first time in days, the roses swayed without wind. Ethan came to in darkness. Not the soft velvet dark of sleep, but a choking, crushing black that pressed against his chest and burned in his throat. His body was stiff, cold, every breath was a struggle, a wet gasp against the weight above him. Dirt filled his mouth, clogged his nose, packed against his eyelids. The pressure was unbearable, heavy, wet, final. He was underground. Panic came in pulses. He kicked, arms bound, twine soaked through. He twisted, screamed, a strangled sound that died an inch from his lips. The soil was thick, clay-like, rich with decay and moisture. Alive. Above him, the world moved on. There was a rhythm, a sound, the crisp metal chime of a spade slicing into dirt. He froze. Through the faint layers of soil and suffocation, he could hear her breathing, steady, calm, whistling. Belle was gardening, planting, singing something, maybe a lullaby, something old and wordless. Each shovel of earth she moved above him felt like a bell tolling. Not for him, for a ritual completed. She spoke to someone, herself. Maybe, or to the flowers. "Let's place you right here," she murmured, "next to the lavender. You'll like the sun in the morning, and the shade by tea time." There was no rage in her voice, no guilt, only the satisfaction of order, of control returned to her world. Ethan, now silenced and absorbed, had become another layer in the fertile memory of her garden. From above, the rose beds were perfect, laid out in even rows, symmetrical, like a graveyard where the tombstones had been replaced with blossoms. Each rose bush marked a story, a betrayal, a forgetting. Belle moved with grace among them, watering, pruning, humming softly. Classical music drifted from a small speaker nearby, something stringed and mournful. Bach or Brahms, filling the greenhouse like incense. Inside the house, tucked between the pages of an old photo album, lay a faded picture. Belle, years younger, beaming beneath the same arbor, her arm around a young man in a gardener's uniform. His hair was different, but the face was the same. Not Ethan, but impossibly close, a twin in time, or a pattern. The sun rose higher, the garden drank its light. And at the wrought iron gate, a new figure appeared, a young man with calloused hands, a leather satchel, boots still wet with morning dew. Belle greeted him with a warmth so precise it felt like muscle memory. "You must be Daniel," she said, reaching for his hand. "Welcome, the garden's been waiting for you." She turned, leading him down the path past the rosebeds. As they walked, the camera would drift downward, past the lace of roots, past the tangled web of worms and stone, until it reached a small placard, pressed deep into the soil beneath the newest bush. The name, written in elegant cursive, Rosa Ethan. A breeze passed, the petals above trembled, and the soil pulsed. Then, silence. A black screen, a voice. Belle's, soft, timeless. Some beauty must be buried. Then the sound of the shovel again, scraping. Steady, unhurried, over and over, as if the garden would never be full. The gravel crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he stepped back onto the property he had once vowed never to return to. Greenwood Hill hadn't changed much. The wrought iron gates still creaked as if sighing with memory, and the long stone path winding up to the estate was now swallowed by creeping vines and wild grass. It had only been 2 years, but time passed differently in a place like this. Slower, deeper. He remembered the rhythm of the house, the way the light fell through the kitchen windows, the scent of lavender that never left the sheets in the guest room. And most of all, her, Dana. She had been the fire he stepped too close to. Married, older, unreachable in every way that mattered. And yet, he had burned for her. When he left, he thought he was doing the right thing, for her. For himself. Now he wasn't so sure. He had received a message last week. Brief and strange. Return to Greenwood. There's work for you again. No questions. Just come. Signed by her husband, Mr. Granger. Daniel had nearly deleted it. But something, guilt, unfinished ache, or curiosity, dragged him back. As he reached the courtyard, the front door opened, and a child burst out. A little boy, maybe 2 years old, with tousled dark hair and impossibly familiar eyes. Green, not just green, but his green, that rare, gold-flecked shade he had seen only in mirrors and photographs from childhood. The boy stopped short when he saw Daniel, then grinned wide and ran straight toward him. "Daddy." Daniel froze. The word cut through him like a blade wrapped in honey. The air vanished from his lungs. He looked toward the door. Dana stood there, motionless, pale. Her eyes found his and held. She said nothing. She didn't move, but she didn't deny it. Daniel knelt, more out of instinct than clarity, and the child wrapped tiny arms around his leg. His name was Liam, the housekeeper would later whisper. No one ever told him who the father was. Dana never spoke of it. Over the following days, the estate returned to its rhythm, silent halls. A schedule shaped around absence. Mr. Granger was rarely home, always at meetings or calls behind locked doors. Dana drifted like smoke from room to room, barely acknowledging Daniel except in the garden, where she would linger longer than necessary, always careful not to stand too close. But Liam always found him. Every morning, he waited at the greenhouse steps. Every afternoon, he insisted on helping rake leaves or pick herbs. And every evening, he called Daniel, Daddy. Uncoached, uncorrected. It gnawed at him. Daniel began watching, not just the boy, but Dana, the way her eyes softened when Liam clung to Daniel's hand, the way her lips parted, just slightly, whenever their gazes met. It wasn't longing, it wasn't guilt, it was something else, a question unasked. And Mr. Granger, he watched too, not openly, but Daniel would find him near the hedges, pretending to be on his phone, or standing just beyond the doorway during dinner. Silent, unmoving. One night, while trimming the ivy, Daniel heard the low murmur of a phone call drifting from the open office window. If he finds out, it's over, all of it, we lose everything. Daniel stopped breathing. He didn't confront anyone. Instead, he waited until Liam fell asleep the next night and carefully snipped a few strands of the boy's hair. He sealed them in a small envelope and mailed them to a private lab he had used once for a botany certification. Discreet, reliable. The waiting was unbearable. 3 days later, a plain white envelope arrived. No logo, Just his name. Inside was a single page. Paternity probability, 99.97%. Daniel sat in the tool shed for over an hour, the paper trembling in his hands, sweat staining his collar. Outside, the sun set behind Greenwood Hill, casting long shadows over the earth. He could hear Liam's laughter echo faintly in the distance. He was a father, and no one had told him. But someone, had worked very hard to make sure he never knew. Daniel confronted Dana in the garden, the dusk light casting long shadows across the roses they once planted together. Her eyes, always soft and evasive, now welled with something heavier, guilt, sorrow, or a truth long held prisoner. "He's mine, isn't he?" Daniel's voice cracked but held firm. "Liam is my son." Dana didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, pale against the rich soil. Before nodding once, a single tear slid down her cheek. And when she finally looked up, her face was unreadable. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered. "I wrote letters. All of them returned. Granger, found out before I could send the truth. He locked down everything, my calls, my mail, my world. You let me leave thinking it was over," Daniel said, breath catching. "You let me walk away from my own child. Because I was scared," Dana said, her voice cracked this time. "Scared of him, of what he would do if he knew Liam wasn't his." Daniel's jaw clenched. The ground beneath him felt less like earth and more like shifting sand. Everything he believed had been pruned and manicured like the garden around them, and just as deceptive. He took a deep breath. "I'm going to fight for him. For Liam, for my son." Dana looked up, startled. "No, don't, please. I have to." The very next morning, Daniel began the legal process. He met with a pro bono lawyer in town who agreed to take the case. Intrigued by the potential implications, a gardener suing a billionaire for parental rights. Mr. Granger responded faster than expected. That same afternoon, two sharply dressed attorneys showed up at Greenwood Hill. They served Daniel with a cease and desist letter and a restraining order petition, claiming he was harassing the Granger family with baseless allegations. Public interest ignited like dry brush. Within days, tabloids and social media caught wind of the scandal, an illicit affair between the madam and the gardener. A secret child, a legal battle threatening the image of one of the state's wealthiest couples. Dana became invisible in her own home. Mr. Granger kept her on a short leash, escorted to and from the estate by private security. She was no longer allowed to speak with Daniel, not even in passing. But one evening, as Daniel returned to the greenhouse, he found a folded note on the bench where Liam liked to sit. In Dana's handwriting, it read, "If I disappear, don't stop fighting, take him, raise him, he deserves the truth." The words seared into Daniel's memory like sunlight through glass. Soon, strange things began happening. His truck's tires were slashed. His tools went missing. The greenhouse was ransacked late one night. And then one morning, he found a black box affixed beneath his dashboard, a tracking device. He didn't report it. He knew better. Granger's reach was long, and local law enforcement's allegiance was murky at best. That same week, Daniel caught sight of Mr. Granger standing at the edge of the garden. Arms crossed, eyes unreadable. When their eyes met, the older man approached slowly, his smile thin and brittle. "I gave you a second chance, Daniel," he said, his tone low but sharp. "You should have stayed in the dirt. Don't make me choose again." Daniel didn't blink. "Maybe it's time you learned the truth always grows back," he said. Granger's smile vanished. That night, Greenwood Hill felt colder. Even the roses seemed to shiver under the wind. The courtroom was sterile and cold, dressed in polished mahogany and the kind of silence that chews at your nerves. The headlines had already painted Daniel as a scandal, the gardener's bastard. One tabloid called Liam, but for Daniel, this wasn't about gossip, this was about blood, about truth, about being a father. Granger's legal team came prepared, armed with documents that danced on the edge of truth and fabrication. A birth certificate listing Granger as the father, signed NDAs that Dana had allegedly agreed to, forbidding discussion of personal matters outside the household. A physician's statement claiming Daniel had no contact with Dana in the months preceding Liam's conception. But then Daniel stood, trembling fingers holding up a single document, the paternity test. The judge scanned the results, eyes narrowing. This test confirms with 99.97% certainty that Mr. Daniel Reyes is the biological father of Liam Granger. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Dana was called to the stand. When she entered, the gallery froze. She wore a turtleneck despite the heat. Her cheeks swollen, purple bruising visible even under concealer. Her hands trembled as she took her oath. "Mrs. Granger," the judge began gently, "do you confirm this relationship with Mr. Reyes?" Dana's lips parted. For a heartbeat, her gaze flicked to Daniel, pleading. Broken, then she lowered her eyes. "No," she said softly, "there was no relationship. That child is not his." Daniel's world fractured. His lawyer reached to steady him as his vision swam. "She's lying," Daniel hissed. "Your Honor, she's terrified." But the judge remained composed. "Do you have any corroborating evidence?" "Mr. Reyes." Daniel's attorney rose, placing a second file on the bench. A handwritten letter, Dana's, confessing everything. And alongside it, a voice recording, Dana and Granger arguing late at night. Her voice panicked. "If he finds out, he'll take him from me. Don't do this." Granger's voice followed, chilling, "Then keep your mouth shut. I won't lose everything because you got sentimental." The judge leaned back, sighing. The court acknowledges Mr. Reyes as the biological and legal father of Liam. However, due to Mr. Reyes' lack of financial stability and consistent housing, and considering the child's current environment, full custody will remain with the Granger household. It was a legal victory, and a personal death sentence. Daniel wept openly as the bailiff handed Liam over. The boy clung to his neck, tiny arms locked in desperation. "Daddy, where are you going?" he asked. Daniel couldn't speak. He only kissed his son's forehead, whispering, "I'll find you, I promise." Mr. Granger took the boy without a word. As he turned to leave, he looked back at Daniel. "He won't remember you." Dana didn't look back. She walked out with her head low, escorted by her personal assistant. But as she passed Daniel's bench, something slipped from her sleeve. A folded piece of paper. He caught it mid-air. Later that night, Daniel sat alone on his porch, rereading the note. "I'm sorry, I had to lie," he threatened Liam, "but you must keep trying. I believe in you." Headlights flashed down the driveway. A dark van, no plates, idled just beyond the gate. Daniel stepped into the shadows, every instinct screaming. He wasn't just fighting for love anymore. Now he was fighting to survive. It started as a whisper in the wind. Daniel Reyes was gone. 1 week after the courtroom storm, his rented room stood hollow. The landlord swore Daniel had left on a Tuesday morning, carrying only a duffel bag and his gardening gloves. The bed was made, the lights unplugged. There was no blood, no broken glass, just the lingering scent of tobacco and pine soap, and the absence of someone who had once clung to the idea of justice like it was oxygen. The police filed it as a voluntary disappearance, a man embarrassed by defeat, slipping quietly into some distant city to rebuild his pride. But neighbors whispered something else. A woman who lived across the hallway claimed she heard footsteps pacing frantically the night before he vanished. Another swore she saw Daniel at the corner payphone, hands shaking, looking over his shoulder as if chased by ghosts. Then came the envelope. A local mail carrier, old and meticulous, remembered Daniel, said the young man had handed him a thick, sealed packet 2 days before disappearing. It was addressed to whom it may concern, and contained a copy of the DNA results, court documents, and something more haunting, a handwritten letter that read more like a slow, bleeding suicide note. "If you're reading this, it means I failed. I lost my son not because of the law, but because the truth means nothing to those who control it. Liam deserves better than a world like this. And if they come for me, let it be known, I never stopped trying." Dana tried to call him, over and over. Each time the number returned an automated message: "This line has been disconnected." She visited the garden, the one Daniel used to tend before dawn. The roses were dying, but beneath a swaying hydrangea bush stood a single blue bloom, new, fresh, unnaturally vibrant. Dana knelt down, her fingers brushing its petals. No card, no signature, but she knew who had left it. Granger addressed the media with his usual polished smile. "We hope Mr. Reyes finds peace. He was a passionate, if troubled, young man. Our prayers are with him." But peace was the last thing Dana found a week later. Liam had gone missing from his crib. The household staff claimed the boy had been with his nanny until 9 p.m., then vanished. He was discovered 4 hours later, locked inside the estate's greenhouse, crying amid the tall ivy and shattered flower pots. No one could explain how he got in, only that the security footage had gone dark that night for exactly 43 minutes. The footage that did leak, from a guard's cell phone, showed a grainy figure moving through the east garden. A man in a hood. Too tall to be a servant. Too cautious to be a thief. He paused by the moonlit fountain and looked directly at the lens before fading into the hedges. Daniel? The police shrugged. They launched no manhunt, no official theory, just filed the incident away. But Dana didn't sleep after that. Every creak in the hallway, every shadow outside the nursery window, every bloom that appeared in the garden unplanted. Something wasn't over, because ghosts don't lock greenhouses. And gardeners don't plant fear, unless they have nothing left to lose. A year passed. The estate at Greenwood Hill stood empty, the house sagging under the weight of stories too heavy to bear. No one wanted it, not after the scandal, the trial, the disappearance, whispers of corruption, fatherhood battles, and an unsolved vanishing wrapped the property like ivy choking brick. Then, one spring, it sold. A new family moved in. They were quiet, polite, wealthy in a clean, new money way. The wife liked orchids. The husband played tennis. They hired contractors to tear down the old gazebo, repaint the moldy shutters, and, most importantly, restore the wild, unkempt gardens. They brought in a landscaping crew, young men with machinery and gloves, cheerful and oblivious. The western garden had been untouched for years, overrun with weeds and thorn bushes. When they dug near the oldest roses, now thorny skeletons of their former selves, someone hit wood. The box was no bigger than a lunch pail, old, weather-beaten, sealed shut with rusted nails. Inside, layered in plastic and wrapped in cloth, they found a photograph, a young man in dirty jeans, holding a watering can, smiling beside a rosebush, written on the back, in ink that had barely faded, "If truth dies, plant it deep." Beneath the photo were documents, a full DNA report confirming paternity, court transcripts, and at the bottom, folded in a silk handkerchief, a small child's necklace engraved with the initials, LD. The landscaper paused. The air around him seemed to still. He turned to the supervisor and said, quietly, "You should see this." The press storm came back with hurricane fury. DNA in the dirt. One headline screamed, "Missing gardener may have left final message." Police reopened the case, but by then, the files were missing, the trial records, misplaced, the custody hearings, lost in transition, the DNA samples, accidentally destroyed. No one could explain it. No one claimed responsibility. Some said the Granger family had paid to have it buried, both literally and administratively. Dana was never seen publicly again. She had moved to the countryside, far from the city, raising Liam in a small house with high fences and low trust. But when the news of the garden box broke, a package arrived, no return address. Inside, a single blue orchid, and a note, "Your son will always know who his father was." Dana wept for the first time in months. Liam, now 4, played alone in the garden. He was gentle with plants, almost reverent. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low, he kneeled by a rosebush and whispered something into the petals. Dana watched from the window. Her heart clenched. Later, when she asked what he had said, he replied simply, "Daddy says this flower never dies." In the final wide shot, the camera pulls away, past Dana, past Liam, past the rosebush, to the edge of the garden where a faded plaque juts from the earth. Just visible beneath the moss are two words: Rosa Daniel. The first time Grace saw Elijah, he was standing beside the rose arch with a pair of rusted shears, the morning sun casting a halo of light around his unruly curls. His shirt was worn at the collar, and his boots were stained with old mud, but he had the kind of stillness about him that made the whole garden hold its breath. She had just come out with her teacup, expecting to find the roses still strangled by weeds. Instead, she found him already halfway through the third row, humming a hymn she vaguely recognized from her childhood. Grace was 49, recently widowed, and fading into a loneliness that had crept into the wood of her house. Her late husband, Charles, had died of a stroke the previous spring. The world had grown too quiet since then, except for the whispers. They came from the walls, from the floorboards, from the wind through the ivy, but most of all from the garden. So when she found a flyer tucked inside her mailbox reading, "Professional gardener available, discreet, skilled, affordable," she took it as a sign. No one remembered seeing the flyer delivered. Maria, her housekeeper, said it hadn't been there in the morning mail. Grace didn't ask questions. She simply dialed the number. A low voice answered, said he could come the next morning. And so he did. Elijah. He never spoke much. His replies were polite but brief. Yet Grace found herself talking more and more. She told him about the winter storm that had ruined the trellis, about Charles's obsession with order, about her dreams of turning the garden into a sanctuary. Elijah listened, always working, always quiet. Every day he arrived just as the sun touched the eastern fence. Always the same faded jacket, always the same rhythm in his steps. Grace began to time her mornings to him: coffee at 7. A walk by 8, a chat near the fountain by 9. She would tell him how her husband never liked roses. Elijah would nod and trim one with care, as if the rose itself deserved an apology. Maria never saw him, not once. At first she brushed it off as coincidence. Elijah came early, she came late, but soon she began to worry. "Miss Grace," Maria said one cloudy afternoon, drying her hands on a dish towel, "I've never seen this man. You talk about him like he's always around." "Are you sure?" Grace interrupted with a soft laugh. "Oh, he's always around. You just don't see him when you're rushing. He's quiet, gentle. You have to look with your heart." Maria. That night, Maria turned on the security cameras. Grace had never used them since Charles passed. The system came back online with a flicker. For 3 days, they recorded. Elijah came and went, just like always. Grace walked with him, laughed with him, handed him lemonade. When Maria reviewed the footage, there was no one there. Just Grace, talking to empty air, laughing at jokes no one had told, pausing mid-conversation with a ghost. "Miss Grace," Maria said again, more gently this time, "there's something wrong." But Grace only smiled. She had stopped brushing her hair. Her meals sat untouched. She no longer read the news. Her entire life was stitched into the soil and petals of the garden, and into Elijah. She called him, "my love," one morning. Then, "my second life," the next. When Maria objected, Grace turned, eyes glassy. "Don't you see, he's the only one who's still real." That night, Grace wrote in her journal, "I think I'm falling in love again. It's strange, and quiet, and a little mad, but isn't all love a little mad?" Outside, the roses trembled in the breeze, and somewhere in the rustle of leaves, Grace could almost hear Elijah humming that old hymn once more. Elijah had stories Grace could almost touch. One late morning, as mist hovered low above the flowerbeds, he told her about his childhood in Tuscany. He spoke with tenderness of a small farmhouse nestled between rows of lavender, of his mother who hummed lullabies while pruning roses, of the way the fog there smelled like thyme and wood smoke. Grace closed her eyes and imagined the scene, not with effort, but with aching familiarity. as though she had been there herself. Just a lifetime ago. They drank tea under the trellis, the fading petals of climbing roses dropping onto their porcelain cups. Elijah described the language of flowers. Daisies are for innocence, he said softly, peonies for shame, and roses, they're never about love, they're about memory. Some things bloom so we remember they once existed. Grace's laugh, thin but bright, rang out through the garden. She hadn't laughed like that in years. Not since Harold died, not since silence took up residence in the halls of the estate. With Elijah, she felt her age retreat. Her skin pulled taut not with youth, but with a pulse of relevance, of feeling seen again. That night, it rained, not a soft drizzle but a full storm, one that rattled windows and shook old tree limbs loose. Grace couldn't sleep. She wrapped herself in a wool shawl and stepped out barefoot into the drenched garden. Heart pounding, and there he was, Elijah, standing still beneath the arbor, soaked but serene. He reached for her hand, and they stood in the rain. It was absurd, it was beautiful. She leaned into him, and in her memory, or was it her dream? He kissed her forehead like someone who knew all her sadness. The next morning, Maria found Grace passed out on the garden bench, shivering. Her nightgown clung to her like wet paper, and her breath came in shallow gasps. The doctor arrived by noon. Grace had a high fever. As she drifted in and out of lucidity, she kept whispering, "He kissed me, he kissed me." Maria grew alarmed, not just by the fever, but by the isolation Grace imposed on herself. The teacups only ever had one lipstick mark. The plates were always cleaned by Grace alone. No one else had seen Elijah. Not the delivery man, not the mailwoman, not the cleaner. Maria began to wonder, was Elijah ever real? When Maria suggested a psychiatrist, Grace responded with fire. "I am in love." Maria, not delusional, "Why do you want to take that away from me?" Then came the wedding dress. Grace called a boutique in town and arranged for a white gown. Simple and elegant, she told them she would marry in the garden on the last Sunday of the month. Maria waited until Grace left for her afternoon walk and accessed the security recordings. She combed through every day, every hour, Grace speaking aloud to no one. Grace pouring 2 cups of tea and drinking both. Grace dancing in the garden with invisible arms. When confronted, Grace only smiled. Elijah doesn't like being filmed. He's very shy, sometimes cameras lie. Maria, that night, her diary bore the line, "He is the light I cannot live without." Outside, the roses swayed in the wind. Inside, Grace slept soundly, one arm outstretched across the bed, fingers curled, as if cradling someone who wasn't there. The sun rose gently over the estate on a crisp spring morning, casting warm light through the ivy-laced windows and across the wild garden paths. In the backyard, Grace stood before her mirror, pale and glowing, a white gown flowing down her figure like mist over morning grass. Her fingers, fragile but determined, fastened each button along her spine with precision. The bouquet she had assembled lay on the vanity, white roses, blue forget-me-nots, and a single purple hyacinth. She called it her wedding bouquet. She had arranged it herself, petal by petal. The night before, Grace moved through the garden with the quiet ceremony of a bride walking an aisle only she could see. She spoke softly, joyfully, to someone beside her, though no one walked there. She set a table in the center of the rose path, complete with white linens, 2 glasses, and a bottle of champagne. One glass remained untouched, bubbling with golden light. The other, she sipped from between murmurs of laughter and love. A neighbor walking his dog paused by the fence, watching. Grace sat at the table, eyes full of emotion, speaking to the air across from her. The neighbor frowned and called for Maria, who rushed outside, alarm in her stride. "Mrs. Grace," Maria pleaded, stepping into the garden, "you're out here alone, there's no one here. Please, come inside." But Grace's expression turned thunderous. Her eyes sharpened with fury. She stood and raised her voice, trembling. "Don't insult my husband like that. You're not invited." Maria froze, heart pounding, her hands raised in surrender. She glanced at the untouched glass. She heard the murmurs of the garden wind, but no other voice. No footsteps, no one at all. The neighbor had recorded the exchange. Within hours, the video spread across local networks. Then wider, re-shared with mocking titles, "Woman Marries the Wind" and "Bride of the Breeze." People watched, commented, laughed. A psychiatrist was sent from the city. He waited in the sitting room while Maria tried to coax Grace inside. But Grace refused to speak unless Elijah could sit with her. She sat cross-legged on the garden bench, white veil fluttering, clutching her bouquet like a relic. Maria, desperate, searched the estate again. She found no employment forms, no phone logs, no background checks, nothing indicating that an Elijah had ever been hired. She even checked the post, the emails, the old gardener's toolshed. Nothing, only Grace's journal, filled with pages about Elijah, their conversations, his favorite teas, the way he hummed when he dug. That evening, Grace sat before her vanity once again. She brushed her hair with slow strokes, humming to herself. The mirror reflected only her, alone, but she smiled as if someone stood behind her, whispering tenderly into her ear. "Tonight," she said aloud, "you'll stay with me." She laid down in the garden once more, the wedding dress slightly dirtied from the grass and soil. She curled beside the rosebush she had tended with such care. Her bouquet nestled at her chest. And all through the night, beneath the moonlight and the restless wind, no one lay beside her. Grace's fever spiked on a pale, overcast Wednesday, the kind of day where the sky itself seems hesitant to commit to light or shadow. The nurses on duty would later recount how her whispers had begun before dawn. Tangled in dream and delirium. "Elijah," she murmured again and again, her voice threadbare and fragile. "Don't leave the garden yet. The roses are blooming." Her hands, once delicate and deliberate in their movements, now clutched at the sheets with a frantic, vine-like urgency, fingers curling and twisting as though reaching for something rooted in a world no one else could see. Maria, exhausted and fraying at the edges of worry, stood at the threshold of Grace's bedroom for a long moment before finally dialing the number she had tucked away like a secret. The psychiatrist arrived later that afternoon, no longer a gentle consultant, but a state-sanctioned decision. A court order was in his coat pocket, crisp and undeniable. Grace, draped in her nightgown like a ghost who hadn't yet accepted she'd died, did not struggle. She merely looked at Maria, eyes clear with something that could have been betrayal or release, and asked softly, "Just don't crush the lavender. It took so long to come back." The psychiatric facility was antiseptic and humming with a false serenity. Grace, now under constant observation, slipped between moments of piercing lucidity and long stretches of fog. She rarely responded to questions about her mental state, but she painted, always the same figure, a man standing quietly in a garden, sometimes cradling a bloom, sometimes cloaked in the rain. One of the nurses, a film enthusiast, noticed the resemblance. The man in the sketches looked eerily like the romantic lead in a forgotten 1980s British drama, a film Grace had adored in the years before Harold died. It had been their comfort on stormy evenings, a small and shared reverie. The same film, Maria would later confirm, had a gardener named Elijah. The doctors met in clean, quiet rooms to diagnose her delusional disorder, compounded by bereavement, prolonged isolation, unresolved grief. The terms were neat, their words cut into her story like scalpels trying to dissect a ghost. They didn't see the longing behind the delusion, the yearning threaded into every imagined syllable, every phantom embrace. Maria visited her a week into her confinement. She looked older, too. Her hands shook as she placed a small pot of lavender on the windowsill of Grace's room. The scent, sharp and earthy, filled the sterile air. Grace, curled beneath a knitted blanket, opened her eyes slowly. "He'll come back, Maria," she whispered, voice nearly gone. "He promised." When the lavender blooms again. The staff began reviewing Grace's journals. Maria had turned them in reluctantly, clutching them like sacred texts. Within, entire worlds unfolded, pages upon pages of conversations between Grace and Elijah. They argued about flowers, shared memories, planned a life that bloomed only on the page. There were no interruptions, no alternate voices, just the cadence of two people, one real, one imagined, building a world from grief and hope. One intern, a young woman with quiet eyes and a heart too soft for this line of work, said that Grace smiled each morning before breakfast. Not a manic grin, not the grin of someone untethered, but the smile of someone expecting a letter, or a kiss, or the sound of footsteps on garden gravel. A smile that made her shift the curtains slightly each time she passed. Every morning, without fail, Grace would ask the same question to whoever entered with medication or breakfast or charts. Her voice was never loud, but it always carried weight. "Did you see him in the garden today? Elijah? He's very shy, but he always comes when the flowers are right." And then she would close her eyes. Not to sleep, but to see what only she could. In that garden behind her eyelids, with its ever-blooming roses and lavender paths, Elijah was still waiting. Years folded over each other like pressed petals, and time softened the lines of Grace's face. At the care facility, where each corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and chamomile tea, she became something of a quiet legend. Grace, the widow in white. Grace, who spoke to flowers. Grace, who waited. Her hair had turned silver, soft as the feathers of the doves that sometimes perched on the garden fence. But her hands, though marked by age, remained graceful, still attuned to the secret rhythms of root and soil. Every morning, before breakfast, she would shuffle out into the hospital's modest garden with a small trowel tucked beneath her arm and a packet of seeds in her apron pocket. She never asked for help. She simply knelt among the leaves, whispering to the plants like old friends. "This one's for Elijah," she'd say to no one in particular, planting a row of purple pansies. He always said they looked like they were listening. The nurses, those who had stayed long enough to know her rhythms, told new patients and younger staff her story in quiet tones. Part warning, part reverence. She fell in love with a ghost, they'd say, but don't feel sorry for her. She loved better than most ever do. Grace spoke little as the years waned, but when she did, it was with the softness of falling leaves. She no longer asked if Elijah had visited. Instead, she spoke to him as though he never left. When her joints ached, she would murmur, I know, you told me to wear the gloves." Then, one morning, a morning like any other, when the dew clung to spiderwebs and the sky stretched gray over the world, Grace did not come out to the garden. A nurse found her in bed, curled toward the window, the lavender pot still on the sill, now in full bloom. In her hands was a leather-bound notebook, the edges worn smooth with love and memory. It was her journal, her chronicle of invisible devotion. The final page bore only one sentence, written in a hand that trembled but still knew beauty. "Love does not need the world to believe in it, only the heart that carries it." At her funeral, which was attended by few but remembered by many, Maria arrived wearing a plain black dress. Her hair was white now, gathered in a bun. She placed a fresh pot of lavender at the foot of Grace's casket and whispered, "You waited so well." A month later, the hospital administrators approved a proposal. The old courtyard garden, once neglected, now blooming in impossible colors, was renamed in her honor. A small wooden sign was planted beside the roses. "The Garden of Light in memory of one who saw what we could not." And the garden seemed to remember her. Birds returned each spring to sing over the marigolds. Bees lingered long at the lavender. And somewhere beneath the soil, a seed of longing grew into peace. One afternoon, a young nurse, new to the ward, wandered out with a watering can. She was humming to herself when she saw someone, standing across the rows. A tall figure, backlit by sun, unmoving between the hedges. She blinked, looked again. No one was there, but the breeze stirred, and the scent of lavender rose in waves. The petals danced, as if stirred by a hand not seen. The nurse smiled despite herself. And from somewhere far, or maybe very close, came the faintest echo. The garden remembers. It always had. Maria had long since mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. In the sprawling estate of the Callaways, where every corner gleamed with polished elegance and every hour was curated like a luxury brochure, Maria moved like breath through glass, silent, invisible, unnoticed. She was 32, born mute, and had worked in the mansion for over 6 years. No one could recall the precise day she'd been hired. She had always just been there. Richard Callaway, the silver-haired patriarch of the house, was a titan of investment. His wife, Evelyn, in her mid-40s, was radiant in that effortless, curated way of women who understood wealth and attention. Her beauty was cold, perfect, like a diamond locked in glass. And Thomas, the new gardener, was young, broad-shouldered, with sun-warmed skin and the kind of smile that made Evelyn tilt her head just so. Maria had noticed it first in the way Evelyn lingered by the hedges. The way her laugh, too high, too practiced, rippled out toward the man pruning roses. Thomas, always polite, said little, but there was a tension to his silence, a deliberate care in where his gaze landed and how long it stayed. Maria, always with a rag in hand or a tray of tea, began to find herself in the periphery of moments that weren't meant for anyone else's eyes. A lingering hand on an arm, a whisper too soft for walls to catch, a glance stretched a second too long. Evelyn acted with the boldness of someone performing in a room she believed was empty. Because to her, Maria didn't count, a maid who couldn't speak, couldn't repeat, couldn't betray, but Maria had ears, and Maria had eyes, and more importantly, Maria had a mind sharpened by years of observation and silence. One afternoon, walking in from the west garden, she saw it, Evelyn's hand on Thomas's cheek, her lips too close. He didn't pull away. Maria said nothing, she never did, but that night, in the privacy of the laundry closet, she took out the small audio recorder she'd hidden behind the linens. The next day, she slipped an old phone, its cracked screen now her window to the truth, into the folds of her apron. She began to record. Each day, as Evelyn and Thomas fed the embers of their affair, Maria gathered sparks, audio clips, photographs, names whispered, promises exchanged under the wisteria. Evelyn grew reckless, Thomas grew nervous, and still, Maria said nothing. Occasionally, Thomas would catch her eyes from across the garden. There was something haunted there, something pleading. He looked like he wanted to say something, to confess, perhaps, but then he would turn away, swallowed by the trellis of deceit he was entangled in. By the end of the week, Maria had catalogued everything. She transferred the files to a small USB, taped it with black ribbon, and tucked it deep inside the seam of her apron, a secret in plain sight, carried between dusters and silverware. That night, in the solitude of her modest room behind the kitchen, she opened her worn notebook. Her handwriting was precise, small, deliberate. On a fresh page, she wrote only one line. I do not need a voice to speak the truth. I only need the truth to speak for me. And then she turned off the light, lay back on the thin mattress, and let the quiet hold her like a friend. Tomorrow, the house would rise again in glittering ignorance. And Maria, the silent witness, would be ready. The heat of early summer hung thick over the Callaway estate. And with it, so did the weight of secrets blooming like weeds. Evelyn had grown bolder. Where once she had been content with whispers and glances, now she allowed herself indulgences in broad daylight. In the garden, where jasmine twisted around wrought iron trellises, she pressed her lips to Thomas's with the recklessness of someone who no longer feared consequences. Thomas responded, hesitantly at first, but increasingly with something darker than desire. It was resignation. They exchanged handwritten notes passed under empty teacups. They disappeared for long stretches into the toolshed, emerging disheveled and flushed. Evelyn's perfume began to linger in the gardener's quarters. To everyone else, it was gossip, but to Maria, it was evidence. Richard Callaway, meanwhile, was consumed with plans for his upcoming 50th birthday, a grand affair that would bring together the city's elite. The manor bustled with florists, caterers, and event planners. In the middle of it all, Evelyn carried herself like a queen, unbothered by the ants beneath her feet. Thomas, however, began to unravel. He grew quieter, his smiles faded. When Maria passed him in the corridor, he looked at her not with guilt, but with pain. She recognized it immediately. One evening, while tidying the study, Maria noticed a photograph had fallen behind the desk. She retrieved it carefully. It was a wedding photo, Evelyn, radiant in white, beside Richard, and in the far background, blurred but unmistakable, stood Thomas. He was younger, his hair longer, but his eyes unchanged. He hadn't been a stranger to the estate. He had been a guest. That night, long after the house had gone still, Maria crept to the filing cabinet in the back office. She checked the staff records. Thomas's name did not appear. Not once. He was not hired through official channels. There were no tax forms. No ID copies. On paper, Thomas did not exist. Later, while replacing linens in the servants' quarters, Maria found Thomas waiting in the shadows of the storage room. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, with eyes that seemed to beg for forgiveness. He placed a hand on his chest, then pointed gently toward her. His voice, when it came, was a broken whisper, "Forgive me." Maria's breath caught. A rush of memories, long buried, crashed into her chest. The man she had once loved, a summer years ago. Laughter in the orchard, a kiss stolen beneath the old elm tree. And then, one day, he was gone. No explanation, no farewell, only silence. And with his silence, she had endured more than heartbreak. There had been a child, unborn, unseen, lost to grief and loneliness. Now he stood before her, not as the stranger who'd captured Evelyn's gaze, but as the ghost of the man who had once promised her everything. Maria didn't cry, she couldn't scream, but inside, the quiet grew louder. Something shifted in her bones. Not anger, not love, something sharper, the quiet resolve of a woman who had watched long enough. As she left the room, her fingers brushed the USB in her apron pocket. It was time the Garden of Lies bore fruit. And the party was only days away. The day before Richard Calloway's grand birthday celebration arrived not with fanfare but with a kind of silent storm. Maria, the maid no one ever truly saw, moved through the estate like a whisper, but in her pocket was something heavier than gold, a small USB drive. The vessel of everything unspoken, the stolen kisses in the rose garden, the late-night trysts in the toolshed, the murmured promises in bedrooms dimmed with betrayal. Maria had documented it all, audio, photos, dates, and now it was time. She placed the USB into a cream-colored envelope. On the front, in her careful handwriting, she wrote a single line, "Truth speaks even when I cannot." Then, like always, she vanished into the background. She left the envelope on Richard's personal desk, beneath a stack of party menus. She knew he would find it. Whether he chose to open it before the event was another matter. As the house transformed into a vision of celebration, caterers arranging hors d'oeuvre on silver trays, florists weaving garlands across balconies, a jazz band tuning instruments in the garden, Maria polished glasses in the corner. Silent as moonlight, Evelyn glided through it all in a silk dress. Laughing too loudly, sipping champagne too early, she kissed Richard on the cheek with the poise of a woman untouched by guilt. Thomas, however, was a man unraveling. His eyes flicked between Evelyn and Maria, shadowed with something unreadable. When the sun dipped behind the hills, the celebration began. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns filled the estate. Laughter echoed against marble columns. Waiters weaved through the crowd. Maria, dressed in a plain black uniform, stood beside the bar with her head bowed. Unnoticed, unseen, Richard took the stage beneath strings of golden lights. He raised a glass to thank his guests, to honor his family, to mark his 50 years with grandeur. And then, with a nod to the AV technician, he said, "A short video, some family memories." The screen flickered. Guests turned toward the projection. At first, it was expected, Evelyn and Richard in Paris. young and laughing, their wedding, their son's graduation. But then, the footage shifted. Evelyn in the garden, fingers entwined with Thomas's. Evelyn in the toolshed, pressed against his chest, whispering something that made him close his eyes in guilt or pleasure, or both. Evelyn in the study, arching her back as Thomas's hands pulled her close. And then, unmistakably, the audio, Evelyn's moans. Thomas's voice, raw and desperate. Gasps rippled through the audience. A few guests turned away. Others stared. Evelyn turned to Richard, her face drained of color. Thomas stepped back from the bar as if struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Richard stood motionless. Then, after a breathless moment, he asked in a voice like steel, "Does anyone know who sent this?" A figure stepped forward. Maria. She moved slowly, not out of fear but out of purpose. In her hands, she held a document, their marriage certificate. 6 years ago, in a small civil courthouse, she and Thomas had pledged themselves to each other. No one at the estate knew. Thomas had disappeared weeks later. Maria had buried her grief and returned to work. Silent, always silent. She handed the paper to Richard, who read it in silence. The crowd was frozen, suspended in a collective gasp. Evelyn opened her mouth, whether it was to plead, to explain, or to lie. No one would know, because Maria stepped back, looked her straight in the eyes. And in that gaze, Evelyn saw the truth. Every quiet moment had been noticed. Every betrayal had been recorded. And the woman she had dismissed as mute had spoken louder than anyone else ever could. Thomas didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply stared at Maria as if she were a mirror he had spent years avoiding. And Maria, she turned and walked back into the crowd, not needing applause, not seeking approval, just letting the truth finally breathe. Above the garden, fireworks exploded into the night sky. But it was the silence left behind that said the most. The morning after the party, the Calloway estate sat in silence. Not the usual hush of luxury, but a stunned, scorched quiet, as if every word whispered the night before still echoed in its marble halls. Within hours of the scandal breaking, news trucks camped outside the iron gates. The affair, the footage, the forgotten maid turned whistleblower. It was the kind of tabloid tragedy the media devoured. Headlines read like fiction: heiress exposed in garden scandal, silent maid, explosive secret, the party that ended it all. Evelyn, once the belle of social galas, vanished from public life. Sponsorships were pulled, contracts dissolved. Brands that once bragged of her affiliation now scrubbed her name from press releases. She lived as a shadow in her own estate, her name now synonymous with disgrace. Thomas fared no better. Questions about his identity surfaced quickly. Without proper documentation, he was detained for immigration violations. On top of that, Richard filed charges of fraud, claiming Thomas had entered the household under false pretenses to exploit wealth. The man who once lingered in sunlight, trimming roses with quiet hands, now sat behind steel bars, his future as tangled as the vines he once nurtured. Maria watched it all unfold from a distance. She didn't gloat, she didn't cry, she sat at the window of her small servants' quarters, watching the reporters swarm, the police arrive, the whispers bloom and rot in the same breath. In her journal, she wrote one line: "Silence is not weakness. It is choice." Richard found her there, 3 days after the party. No guards, no pomp, just an aging man, stripped of pride. He stood at her door like a student asking forgiveness. "I should have seen you," he said, "all these years. You were right there." Maria said nothing, only tilted her head, waiting. "I owe you," he added. "Name it, money, reference, anything." She shook her head, slowly, graciously, and with it, dismissed a decade of invisibility. There was nothing he could give her now that hadn't already been lost. A week later, Maria left. She packed one small suitcase, her journal, an old pocket watch, a gift from her father, and a torn wedding photo, folded once across the middle. No one saw her go. She slipped through the morning mist like she had arrived, silent. unnoticed, present only in the way absence sometimes echoes louder than presence ever could. From the back of the bus, Maria looked out the window. The estate, once sprawling and proud, receded into the fog. The lavender in the front garden swayed in the breeze, as if waving farewell, and for the first time in many years, Maria smiled, a smile that spoke volumes, a smile that needed no sound at all. 1 year after the night that shattered illusions and set truths ablaze, Richard Calloway did something no one expected from a man once known for his luxury, power, and stoic pride. He built a sanctuary. It stood not behind gilded gates or velvet curtains, but at the heart of the city's immigrant district, a modest, sunlit space called Maria's Voice. The center wasn't glamorous. There were no chandeliers or champagne galas, but on its walls were framed portraits of workers, cooks, cleaners, gardeners, drivers, and at its core was a story Richard told at every fundraiser, school visit, and policy meeting, the story of a woman who never spoke a word, but who had the courage to say what no one else would. He never mentioned Evelyn by name. She had vanished into the folds of foreign headlines, retreating to Europe under a new surname, selling off shares, and slipping into silence more permanent than Maria's had ever been. She became a ghost in every social circle she once dominated, her name now synonymous with betrayal in hushed whispers. Thomas, too, disappeared, but not in exile by choice. His forged documents were exposed, his connections severed. He was deported quietly, stripped of rights, vanishing into a system that rarely left trails. No one knew where he went. No one asked. Maria, meanwhile, did not seek revenge or riches. She resettled in a small town nestled between hills, where the air smelled of pine and the streets echoed with simplicity. She found a job at a flower shop, a humble one-room space filled with the scent of lilies and lavender. There, she watered petals and arranged bouquets for weddings she would never attend and funerals she would never cry at. It was a peaceful life, not glamorous, not loud, but hers. One crisp morning in early spring, a package arrived without a return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the weight of the box felt strangely known. She opened it slowly, carefully, like peeling back the past. Inside, cushioned in old newspaper, was a small black recording device, the one she had used so long ago. Thought lost in the storm of that unforgettable night. She turned it over in her hand, breath catching in her throat. With trembling fingers, she pressed play, crackling static, then the sound of wind, a deep inhale, and then, Thomas's voice, softer than she remembered, and infinitely sadder. Maria, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I never did. I should have stayed. I should have fought, but I was afraid. Afraid of who I was. Afraid of what I'd lose. You were always the strong one. You were always the voice between us. Even without sound. I'm sorry. You've always been the only truth I ever knew. Silence. Then a whisper. You were my voice. And now, I hope this helps you find yours. Maria sat still for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes full, yet dry. Then, slowly, tears began to fall, not from pain, but from a quiet release. A decade of heartbreak exhaled in a single breath. She rose, walked to the small kitchen where a bundle of lavender waited in a glass jar. She arranged the flowers with deliberate care, as if composing a poem from stems and color. And then, she placed the recorder beside them. She walked to the mirror near the doorway. Her reflection was older, quieter, but radiant with a light that had been missing for years. With one gentle finger, she wrote across the fogged glass from the tea kettle, I am not silent anymore. No audience, no applause, just the truth. The screen fades to black. White letters appear. Justice has many voices, even the silent ones. And then, only stillness. Elena had always known that wealth did not equate to warmth. At 27, she lived in a marble palace where every surface gleamed, every step echoed, and every conversation with her 62-year-old husband, Gregory, felt like negotiating with a ghost. Gregory, once a powerful man of industry, had grown colder and more withdrawn since the car accident 3 years ago, an accident that left him with a limp, a tremor in his left hand, and, most devastatingly, a diagnosis that ensured he could never father children. Their marriage had always been a transaction more than a romance. Elena was the daughter of a diplomat, raised in boarding schools and marble dining halls. Gregory had offered her security, status, and a life free of financial concern. What he couldn't offer, what Elena quietly buried within herself, was touch. Intimacy, the feeling of being wanted, not owned. When the new gardener arrived, Elena didn't even notice at first. His name was Alex, tall, quiet, olive-skinned with rough hands and soft eyes. He spoke little, worked hard, and seemed to disappear the moment the task was done, but it was in the way he tended to the roses, gently, reverently, that Elena first felt the stirrings of something dangerous, something alive. She began to walk the garden path more often. Sometimes she would ask Alex questions about the soil, the flowers, the changing seasons, questions she didn't really need answered. He would look up, startled at first, then reply with a nod or a soft-spoken sentence. His voice was low, careful, like someone who had spent years listening more than speaking. One afternoon, Elena reached out to touch a thorn stem, only to prick her finger. Alex, who had been pruning the hydrangeas nearby, rushed over and took her hand gently in his. Their eyes met. It was a moment no longer than a breath, but in that instant, something cracked, not in the world, but in her, a fracture of longing, a breach in a dam built too high for too long. The first kiss happened during a summer storm. Rain pelted the glass of the greenhouse, turning the world outside into a blur of motion. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of jasmine and wet earth. Elena had gone to find Alex, claiming she was checking on the dahlias. He had turned around, startled, raindrops on his shoulders. Neither spoke. She stepped closer. He didn't move, and when their lips met, it was not timid, it was surrender. That night, they crossed a line neither could uncross. The days that followed were a dance of silence and stolen glances. The security cameras around the estate had long gone disused. Gregory never checked them, and Elena knew exactly which corners remained unseen. The garden became their sanctuary, beneath the willow tree, inside the old potting shed, in the lavender fields at dusk. Every encounter burned with risk, and yet, it was the only time Elena felt truly alive. She began writing again, in a small, leather-bound journal she kept hidden beneath her pillow. She scribbled thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. I have never been touched this way. I have never been looked at as if I were more than porcelain. And yet, Alex remained distant at times. After their encounters, he would linger for a moment too long before slipping away. There was a sadness to his eyes, something haunted, that Elena didn't dare probe. Perhaps it was shame, or fear, or something else entirely. 2 months passed before the nausea came. At first, she thought it was stress. Then came the missed cycle. The trembling hands. The silent prayers to no one. The test in the bathroom, 2 lines. Clear, definite. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat on the floor, palm over her stomach, heartbeat loud in her ears. Then she found Alex in the garden, trimming back the vines. I'm pregnant, she whispered. He dropped the shears. Silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, took her hands, and held them tightly. She felt him trembling. We have to leave, he said, now, before anyone finds out. In that moment, Elena understood 2 things. That she had never felt so alive, and that something in Alex's voice hinted at a truth she had yet to uncover. The storm didn't break with thunder, but with a legal notice. Elena had nearly completed her plan, bags packed beneath her dresser, fake IDs arranged by a contact in the next town, and enough cash from discreet withdrawals to buy their anonymity. She and Alex were set to leave after one final night together in the greenhouse, where their affair had first bloomed under mist and moonlight. But fate, in its cruel precision, has a way of cutting through even the thickest fantasy. Gregory Callahan, her husband and the master of the estate, had announced during breakfast that he intended to revise his will. His health, never robust since the accident, had taken a quiet downturn. He wanted to ensure that Elena, his young, beautiful wife, would be provided for. And so, as part of the legal procedure, the family lawyer suggested routine DNA confirmation to protect the estate from future claims. Gregory had nodded in weary agreement. Elena had smiled faintly, hiding the storm inside her. Elena, believing their secret was perfectly concealed, had no reason to panic. Alex had been careful, no one had seen them. But that very afternoon, he vanished. His quarters were left tidy. The small wooden cross he kept by his bedside was gone. His phone, always left charging on the kitchen shelf, was now silent. No note, no message, just absence, as chilling as a locked door in a burning house. The results arrived 3 days later. Elena was pregnant. That, no longer a suspicion, became a declaration, but the second page of the report was what shattered her world. The fetal DNA was compared to Gregory's as part of a legal standard. And while Gregory was not the father, of course not, he was genetically a direct relative. She read it once, then again, the numbers did not lie. The child inside her was Gregory's grandchild. Elena stumbled back from the table, her hand pressing over her abdomen. A sickness surged, not from the pregnancy, but from the implications. Her affair had not been with a stranger, not with a simple employee, but with blood, family. She tried to call Alex, her fingers trembling against the screen. Voicemail. She tried his email. The messages bounced. She went to his quarters again, pulling open drawers, overturning sheets, as if he might be hiding beneath the furniture. Nothing. Only a single book remained, The Count of Monte Cristo. On the last page, a line underlined in pencil, "Wait and hope." That night, she confronted Gregory. The fireplace crackled in the background, throwing long shadows across his face. He didn't look surprised when she held the report up to him. Only tired. "Alex," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "is my blood, from another life, from a mistake I never dared to claim." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse or question. He simply looked at her. And for a moment, Elena couldn't tell if his expression was grief or victory. She stepped back, her heart pounding not just with betrayal, but with something deeper, something grotesque. The man she had loved, who had made her body feel awake for the first time in years, was the secret son of the man she had married. She was carrying Gregory's heir, a bastard's child. A twisted echo of legacies tangled in deception and flesh. Elena sat on the bathroom floor that night, staring at her reflection in the glossy tiles. She whispered to herself, barely audible over her own heartbeat, "What have I done?" But the answer didn't come, because it had already taken root inside her. The scandal did not erupt, it seeped, like spilled ink across silk, slow and irrevocable. It began with whispers in the corridors of privilege. Someone, perhaps a clerk, perhaps a nurse, leaked the news of the DNA test. Within days, society pages were buzzing with speculation. Then certainty. Elena Callahan, wife of the reclusive magnate Gregory Callahan, was pregnant, and the child was not her husband's. But the true shock, whispered like a curse behind manicured hands, was that the unborn child was Gregory's grandchild. The revelation tore through the upper circles of power like lightning across a clear sky. Gregory, who had spent decades cultivating the image of stern wealth and discreet dignity, called a press conference in the gold-paneled ballroom of their estate. Cameras rolled as he stood beside Elena, pale and expressionless. He placed a hand on her back, a gesture that felt more like possession than comfort. "My wife has made a grave error in judgment," he began, voice low, perfectly measured, "but this family believes in grace, in forgiveness." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then came the final blow. "The child she carries will not bear my name. I wish her peace, but this matter is closed." With that, Elena became a ghost in her own home. The mansion that once shimmered with guests and warm conversation grew silent. Staff avoided her, friends stopped calling, she ate alone, walked alone, carried her growing burden in silence. Each hallway echoed with the sound of betrayal. She wandered through the gardens like a widow in mourning. But it wasn't Gregory she mourned. It was Alex, vanished like mist. Desperation turned into resolve. Elena hired a private investigator, sparing no expense. Yet every trail led nowhere. No bank account, no passport, no digital footprint. It was as if Alex had never existed. The only trace left behind was the child in her womb, now strong enough to kick against her ribs. And then, a letter. It arrived from Mexico, handwritten, the ink smudged slightly with haste. There was no return address. Just a single sheet inside. Elena, I never meant for this to happen. I came to see him. Just once. My mother died with only his photo on her wall and no name on her lips. I had nothing but that image, and a question that haunted me. Then I saw you. I didn't know who you were. Not at first, but I stayed for you. Even when I realized the truth. I couldn't stop. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I did. Forgive me, Alex. Elena's hands shook as she read. The paper trembled like a wounded bird. Her vision blurred, not from the tears alone, but from the overwhelming collision of love, loss, and the monstrous irony of fate. In that moment, the child inside her stirred for the first time. She gasped, life, not sin, not shame, not legacy, life. That night, she sat by the window, bathed in moonlight, and wrote in her journal. Her handwriting was steadier than her voice had been in weeks. It wasn't his fault. He didn't choose to be born in shadows. And this child is not a mistake, not a scandal, not a curse. He is mine. He is love's last truth. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest, breathing in the silence. Outside, a single bloom had opened on the old magnolia tree, out of season. Out of time, but still, it bloomed. So would she. The courtroom was cold, not from temperature but from intention. The weight of legacy, betrayal, and unspeakable bloodlines hovered like a fog no voice dared pierce. Gregory Callahan sat straight-backed in a charcoal suit, more granite than man. On the opposite side, Elena, visibly pregnant now, wore a muted blue dress, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Despite the tabloids, the whispers, the isolation she had endured, she held her head high. Because inside her, a truth was kicking, breathing, growing. Gregory had come prepared. As always, he brought his new will, revised with haste and cruelty. Every cent of his empire, properties, businesses, art collections, even the vineyard, was to be donated to a charitable foundation established under his own name. Not a single dollar for Elena. Not a single mention of the child. Elena's lawyer stood and spoke first, calmly laying out the request for divorce and petitioning for acknowledgement of paternity and the unborn child's inheritance rights. Gregory remained silent until his turn. When he rose, he didn't look at Elena. He looked at the judge. I will not allow a child born of incest to carry my name. He said, no rage, no raised voice, just cold steel and shame masquerading as moral superiority. Let her find dignity somewhere else. The room tensed, but Elena's lawyer didn't flinch. They unveiled evidence Gregory had long buried. Regular wire transfers made to a woman named Clara Reyes for over 2 decades. A woman who died in poverty despite the quiet charity. This, the lawyer said, holding up the documents, is financial acknowledgement. He may not have signed a birth certificate, but he funded her life. He knew. The judge examined the records in silence. A pause that felt biblical. The decision came by noon. Alex, though never publicly claimed, had been financially and intentionally supported by Gregory for decades. Under the law, that counted, and because of that, Elena's child, Gregory's grandchild, was a legitimate heir. Gregory didn't speak, he didn't wait, he simply stood, adjusted his coat, and walked out of the courtroom. Cameras caught him outside, but he said nothing, a monument crumbling inward. Inside, Elena stood slowly. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely heard. Her gaze was fixed forward. Steady, she walked out not as a disgraced wife, not as a scandal, but as a mother who had reclaimed her child's future. Outside the courthouse, a figure waited. He wore a faded cap, his back slightly hunched, fingers nervously intertwined. When she reached him, he didn't speak, he simply held out his arms. And she walked into them. No words, only forgiveness, only a shared ache, and a fragile promise that whatever had shattered behind them, something tender had begun to grow ahead. 2 fathers, 1 house, 1 unborn child destined to break the cycle. The garden, somewhere, would bloom again. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and rosemary through the wooden shutters of the small cottage nestled at the foot of the hills. A year had passed since the firestorm of scandal, betrayal, and revelation that once defined Elena's name. Now, she moved through quiet mornings and sun-drenched afternoons with a kind of stillness that could only be earned through surviving chaos. She lived not in a mansion, but in a humble home with clay tiles and a backyard that pulsed with color, roses, lavender, marigolds, and rows of vegetables carefully nurtured by hands that once trimmed aristocratic hedges. Alex was always outside by sunrise, dirt under his nails, a sun hat shading his tanned face, the same quiet grace he had shown in their first stolen glance. But now, he whistled as he worked, often glancing toward the window where Elena rocked their baby boy, humming lullabies that had no words, only warmth. The child, named Matteo, was full of laughter and light. His eyes, almond-shaped and curious, mirrored Elena's depth, but his mouth curled in the same half-smile that had once disarmed her in a storm-drenched greenhouse. He grew among the herbs and petals, his steps wobbly but determined, his fingers always reaching for life. They didn't have wealth, not anymore, but they had peace, they had truth, and every morning Elena whispered to Matteo, "You were born from a love they couldn't understand. But we do." Elena told him stories under the apricot tree, not of kings or castles, but of seeds, and soil, and a gardener who waited in silence until the flowers taught the world to listen. There were no crowns in her tales, just hands that healed and hearts that remembered. One breezy afternoon, a letter arrived from a solicitor's office. Elena held it with the careful dread of someone used to bad news disguised in formality. She read it twice before speaking. Gregory Callahan was dead, a quiet death in his sleep. The man who had tried to erase both sun and truth had made a final gesture. He left a parcel of land to the child born from the affair. A vineyard, once tended by Gregory's father, abandoned for decades but now passed on to the blood that had once threatened his legacy. Elena didn't cry, she didn't rejoice, she simply folded the letter, pressed it against her lips, and whispered something no one heard. Weeks later, they visited the land. The vines were wild, unruly, wrapped around memories. Alex walked ahead with Matteo on his shoulders, the boy giggling at butterflies and sunbeams. Elena followed slowly, her fingers brushing against old wooden posts, half-buried stones, and weeds that once crowned empire. When they reached the center of the field, Alex knelt. He lowered Matteo to the ground and held him close. "This," he said, voice soft, "was where my grandfather planted hope. And now, so will we." Elena sat beside them, the earth warm beneath her. She looked into Alex's eyes, not the lover she once ran from, but the man who stayed, scarred yet whole, for the first time in years. There was no fear in her gaze, no shadow of shame, only sunlight. Matteo clapped, then laughed aloud, a bright, clear sound that scattered birds into flight. And in that vineyard, where blood had once been a curse, life blossomed from the roots of truth. No longer a scandal, no longer a secret, only a family, finally planted where they could bloom. The wind carried the scent of jasmine and rosemary through the wooden shutters of the small cottage nestled at the foot of the hills. A year had passed since the firestorm of scandal, betrayal, and revelation that once defined Elena's name. Now, She moved through quiet mornings and sun-drenched afternoons with a kind of stillness that could only be earned through surviving chaos. She lived not in a mansion, but in a humble home with clay tiles and a backyard that pulsed with color, roses, lavender, marigolds, and rows of vegetables carefully nurtured by hands that once trimmed aristocratic hedges. Alex was always outside by sunrise. Dirt under his nails, a sun hat shading his tanned face. The same quiet grace he had shown in their first stolen glance. But now, he whistled as he worked, often glancing toward the window where Elena rocked their baby boy, humming lullabies that had no words, only warmth. The child, named Matteo, was full of laughter and light. His eyes, almond-shaped and curious, mirrored Elena's depth, but his mouth curled in the same half-smile that had once disarmed her in a storm-drenched greenhouse. He grew among the herbs and petals, his steps wobbly but determined, his fingers always reaching for life. They didn't have wealth, not anymore, but they had peace, they had truth, and every morning Elena whispered to Matteo, "You were born from a love they couldn't understand. But we do." Elena told him stories under the apricot tree. Not of kings or castles, but of seeds, and soil, and a gardener who waited in silence until the flowers taught the world to listen. There were no crowns in her tales, just hands that healed and hearts that remembered. One breezy afternoon, a letter arrived from a solicitor's office. Elena held it with the careful dread of someone used to bad news disguised in formality. She read it twice before speaking. Gregory Callahan was dead, a quiet death in his sleep. The man who had tried to erase both sun and truth had made a final gesture. He left a parcel of land to the child born from the affair. A vineyard, once tended by Gregory's father, abandoned for decades but now passed on to the blood that had once threatened his legacy. Elena didn't cry, she didn't rejoice, she simply folded the letter, pressed it against her lips, and whispered something no one heard. Weeks later, they visited the land. The vines were wild, unruly, wrapped around memories. Alex walked ahead with Matteo on his shoulders, the boy giggling at butterflies and sunbeams. Elena followed slowly, her fingers brushing against old wooden posts, half-buried stones, and weeds that once crowned empire. When they reached the center of the field, Alex knelt. He lowered Matteo to the ground and held him close. "This," he said, voice soft, "was where my grandfather planted hope. And now, so will we." Elena sat beside them, the earth warm beneath her. She looked into Alex's eyes, not the lover she once ran from, but the man who stayed, scarred yet whole, for the first time in years. There was no fear in her gaze, no shadow of shame, only sunlight. Matteo clapped, then laughed aloud, a bright, clear sound that scattered birds into flight. And in that vineyard, where blood had once been a curse, life blossomed from the roots of truth. No longer a scandal, no longer a secret, only a family, finally planted where they could bloom. The plan was supposed to be a dream stitched together with sweat and hope. Violet leaned over the sun-warmed porch rail, eyes fixed on the horizon where the garden melted into open sky. Summer's end was inching closer, but in her heart, something new had begun to bloom, a reckless possibility wrapped in Luke's calloused hands and quiet eyes. She told herself it wasn't just lust. It was rebirth, the kind of aching, dangerous resurrection that only came when a woman had been too long unloved. Her plan was simple: sell the old cottage she had inherited in Vermont, take the cash, disappear with Luke, start fresh in a place where no one knew the name Callahan or the taste of money thickened with control. Luke had hesitated when she first brought it up. That hesitation lingered in the way his brow folded like an unread letter. But Violet was persistent. She painted a picture of a simple life, a garden of their own, a house with a red door, a room where no one screamed in silence. And one night, when the moon was fat and the air smelled of cut grass and sweat, Luke finally whispered, "You're the first person who ever made me want to stay." They sealed it with a kiss in the tool shed, surrounded by rakes and dirt and a shared longing. Violet felt 16 again, dangerous, desired, alive. They found an old car together. A rust-tinged sedan parked behind the bar owned by one of Violet's high school friends. She paid cash. No names. No questions. The car waited like a coiled secret in that lot for 3 weeks while they prepared. Every morning, Violet smiled wider. Every evening, she counted the days. Then Charles came home. He arrived 2 weeks early. With no warning and no explanation. Walked through the front door with the same slow confidence he wore at board meetings and charity galas. He kissed Violet on the cheek like a man who hadn't spent months abroad. Sat down at the dining room table. Asked about dinner. Smiled. It was wrong. Violet felt it immediately, like a draft under a locked door. She studied him, waiting for questions, accusations, a flicker of suspicion, but nothing came. Charles was smooth, controlled, even charming. He made jokes over dessert. Asked about the garden. That night, Violet whispered her doubts to Luke. In the quiet corner of the greenhouse. She said, "Something's off. He knows. He has to." Luke shook his head, fingers brushing her cheek. "He doesn't see you, Violet. He never did. That's why you're here with me. We're safe." She wanted to believe him. The next morning, they took a photo together. It was the first and only one. Violet framed it in her mind, his arm around her waist. Her hair tangled from the wind. Their smiles awkward and wide. She printed a copy, folded it into her diary. That night, she wrote a letter, not to Luke, to Charles. "You don't love me, and I don't fear you anymore. I am leaving." She placed it in an envelope, sealed it with her initials, and left it under his whiskey decanter. Then she packed. Not much. A few clothes, cash, her mother's jewelry, heirloom pieces untouched by Charles's greed. She touched each one before tucking it away, as if asking for permission. Luke came late, dirt still on his sleeves. He kissed her hands first, then her mouth, then her stomach. "Tomorrow," he said, "we drive until the world forgets our names." And Violet, for the first time in years, believed in a tomorrow she could touch. Neither of them saw the car bomb beneath the rusted sedan. Not that night, not yet. The flowers they had watered that evening glistened in moonlight, as if weeping for what morning would take away. The sky was still a shade too dark for dawn when Violet stepped out of the house for what she believed would be the last time. Her heels clicked softly on the driveway, muffled by the fog that hugged the early morning streets. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only the kind of quiet determination that had been blooming inside her all summer. In her bag were a few essentials: cash, a toothbrush, her mother's pearl brooch, and a small envelope addressed to Charles. The alley was silent, a forgotten sliver of the city behind a mechanic's yard. Luke stood there waiting beside the car, a battered old Volvo with dented doors and dusty windows. He looked different in the half-light, not like a lover or a fantasy, but like someone on the verge of something permanent. He didn't move when he saw her, just smiled, faint and tired, like he already knew how this would end. Violet slid into the passenger seat, placing her hand gently on his leg. There was a pause, not long, but heavy. The key was already in the ignition. She turned to Luke, expecting a whisper, a joke, something to break the tension. He only said, "Are you ready?" She nodded. Her fingers reached for the key. Then came the sound, the kind of sound that ends sentences and silences futures. A blast tore through the alley like thunder confined to one breathless second. The fireball bloomed upward and outward, turning steel into smoke and glass into stars. Windows shattered across the block. Alarms screamed into the silence that followed. And the old Volvo was reduced to nothing but ash, metal, and questions. By the time the authorities arrived, there was little to piece together. 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition, no movement, no survivors. The tags on the car matched the plates registered to Violet's deceased uncle. The VIN number was unreadable. The police suspected a fuel leak. The media framed it as a tragic accident, 2 lovers running away, lost to mechanical fate. Charles, composed in a navy suit and dark sunglasses, stood beside a pair of caskets at the memorial held 3 days later. He gave a brief eulogy, voice cracking once. He placed a single white rose on Violet's casket, then stood still long enough for the cameras to catch the tear that rolled from his eye. It made the evening news. But 3 blocks from the explosion, grainy CCTV footage told a different story. The timestamp showed 5:06 a.m. The same alley, the same car. Luke opened the driver's door, glanced toward the camera, just for a moment, and stepped out. He walked away, calmly, purposefully, not toward the city or the street, toward the darkness. 7 seconds later, the car exploded. The footage was archived, not aired. A detective labeled it a technical inconsistency. The file disappeared from the public database within a week. Luke was never seen again. No bank withdrawals, no hotel records, no passport scans. It was as if he had never existed. But Violet's face lived on news feeds, in gossip columns, a cautionary tale, a rich man's wife who chased love and met fire. No one asked what she had been running from, only what she had run into. In the silence that followed, Charles's empire grew, shares rose, insurance paid out, sympathy turned to respect, and in the garden behind the mansion, the roses bloomed that year brighter than ever before. No one noticed that Violet's favorite flower, an obscure hybrid of ivory and crimson, had been removed from the beds entirely. As if she had never touched the soil. As if she had never been there at all. The media painted Charles as a man of impossible strength, a betrayed husband mourning with dignity. Turning grief into philanthropy, he gave interviews, held Violet's hand in framed photos, told stories of their early years together, how she loved lavender tea and old French movies. "I forgive her," he said, his voice breaking just enough for the audience to ache. "Love makes us blind sometimes. I only wish she had come back to me." Behind the curtain of sympathy, a different kind of performance unfolded. Within weeks of Violet's death, Charles collected the full payout from her life insurance policy, $12 million wired into a series of offshore accounts. The media didn't question the speed of the transfer or the unusually high value of the policy. Nor did they wonder how quickly the house in Vermont, the same one Violet had planned to escape to, was sold. Under the authorization of a mysterious legal representative, whose name had never appeared before in any family documentation. But not everyone accepted the fairy tale of a grieving widower. A private investigator, operating under an alias and employed by an unnamed source, began digging. What he found was buried deep in the archives of Charles's past, old employee rosters, financial misconduct, and a name that should have raised alarms. Luke, or rather, Lucas Thornwell, had once worked for Charles, not as a gardener but as a junior financial consultant. Years ago, Lucas had been quietly dismissed after a minor scandal involving manipulated numbers and a misplaced $40. Charges were never filed. The affair vanished into silence. But the man hadn't. In a fireproof safe in Charles's private office, unlocked under dubious circumstances, the investigator found correspondence. Letters, emails, one note, hand-scrawled and yellowed with time, said only, "The gardener angle is perfect. She won't suspect." There were also wire transfers, modest, but regular, sent to Lucas over the course of months. Their frequency increased shortly before Violet's death. In one encrypted message, Charles had written, "Just make sure the story ends clean." When subpoenaed, Charles appeared in court with an army of lawyers and a placid smile. But the file that held the key documents, correspondence, wire logs, even Lucas's fake references, went missing from the evidence locker. No chain of custody, no explanation. Charles returned to his mansion untouched. Reputation scrubbed clean. The press labeled the hearing a baseless attack by conspiracy theorists. In an interview days later, he leaned into the camera, eyes cold behind reading glasses. "Some people," he said, "don't know how to stay in their place." He meant Violet. He meant Lucas. He meant anyone foolish enough to believe the flowers in his garden grew without blood beneath the roots. The mansion sat empty. its windows like blank eyes, watching nothing and no one. After the hearings and the storm of media attention, Charles quietly sold the estate and vanished from American soil. Some said he relocated to Monaco, where money glides easier and questions are never asked twice. No one followed, no one cared. The house, once pulsing with secrets and trimmed hedges, now wore dust like an overcoat. The garden, once Violet's sanctuary, decayed. The trellises she used to walk beneath sagged under dead vines. The roses that once blazed with color now hung their heads, petals browned and falling. The hybrid blooms she had cultivated, the ivory crimson varietals named for memories only she cherished, withered in the soil. No gardener left to whisper them into life. No one returned to water. No one returned to grieve. And then, a year later, on an afternoon split by wind and sun, a young woman with a camera slung over her shoulder happened to wander past. She had no name worth mentioning, just a love for forgotten places and the pull of decayed beauty. The mansion drew her in like a song from another life. She crept through the iron gate, stepped lightly over cracked stones, and entered the skeletal garden. There, on a moss-covered bench, she saw something out of place, a bouquet. Fresh, delicate stems tied with twine, blooms pale and red, as if dipped in gilt. They sat in the center of the bench like an apology. Beneath the bouquet was a slip of paper, soft with dew, on which was scrawled in fading ink, "Forgive the bloom. It never wanted to be born here." She took the flowers, brought them back to her flat and pressed them in a book. A week later, a botanist friend said the flowers were unlike anything he'd seen, a hybrid undocumented in public records. A rumor began to spread among online forums that the flowers came from the garden of the dead wife. Whispers swirled that a woman had died in fire, that a gardener had vanished, that the blooms had memory. Not long after, news broke: Charles was dead. A stroke. In a hotel room in Monte Carlo. No one claimed the body for days. When the embassy finally arranged a burial, no one came. The press, once hungry for his quotes, published one short line: financier Charles W. Eaton, 64. Died abroad. No known survivors. But there were sightings. In a seaside town across the world. Near a fish market and ferry docks. A florist sold rare blooms from the back of a bicycle cart. His hair was longer, his beard thicker, he spoke little, smiled less. The cart always had one flower, a soft ivory base with crimson veins like roots. The children called him the ghost gardener. No one knew his real name. But one child swore he heard the man humming once, a song about rain and ashes. The story ends where all stories do, with a place that no one visits, a garden choked by time, and a final line, carved into a broken sundial among the dead petals. Some gardens don't grow flowers, they grow ghosts. It began not with suspicion or betrayal, but with laughter, the kind that slips out before you know what it means. Rosa, the housekeeper, stood alone in the Beckford kitchen, wiping down a marble counter that gleamed even at dusk. She was humming, lost in routine, when the voice broke through the silence. Crisp, feminine, unmistakably intimate. "Harder, Marco," said the voice, not whispered, not shy, but playful and laced with desire. Rosa froze, the dishcloth suspended in midair. She turned toward the wrought iron birdcage by the kitchen window. There, perched regally with iridescent feathers and a tilted head, was Mango, the Beckford's blue and yellow macaw. The parrot blinked at her and fluffed his feathers proudly, as if he had performed a rehearsed line from a play. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because she didn't know what else to do. In that moment, the absurdity of a bird speaking like a sultry actress in a late-night drama was enough to crack a nervous giggle. But even as her laughter echoed, something coiled inside her, a slow, creeping unease. The Beckford estate was nestled in the hush of suburban wealth, surrounded by manicured lawns and privacy hedges taller than most men. Its security system was state-of-the-art, designed to keep out the world and preserve the illusion of control. But inside, among all the locks and cameras and silent alarms, lived a creature that noticed everything. Mango was not just a bird. He was Lydia Beckford's confidant, her constant companion through long, lonely stretches of marriage. Lydia, with her effortless beauty and voice like velvet soaked in wine, often sat by Mango's cage for hours. She sang to him in French. She read poetry aloud. She whispered secrets while sipping Chardonnay in the afternoon sun. Mango, ever the attentive student, soaked it all in: words, cadence, emotion. Lydia's husband, Henry Beckford, was rarely home, a man whose handshake had closed million-dollar deals across 5 continents. Henry had built his empire on absence. His homecomings were events, scheduled like quarterly reports. And Lydia, she had grown used to absence. Too, she dressed for herself. She dined alone. She laughed into her wineglass when no one was watching. The next morning, Rosa found herself lingering near the parrot's cage. Part of her wanted to hear it again. Maybe she'd misheard. Maybe Mango had learned the phrase from television. But Mango didn't repeat himself, at least not right away. Instead, he clicked his beak rhythmically, paced the perch, then looked her in the eye and said, "You like that?" This time, Rosa didn't laugh. Her stomach tightened. The words didn't sound like TV. They didn't sound like Lydia reading poetry. They sounded like something overheard. Something private. Something raw. That night, lying in her small room off the service hallway, Rosa barely slept. She kept hearing the parrot's voice, too familiar, too knowing. The following day, as she folded laundry in the linen room, Mango added a third phrase. Whispered, delicate, "Don't stop, baby." Rosa's hands froze. The warmth of fresh towels did nothing to stop the chill creeping down her spine. She wasn't a nosy woman. She minded her place, but something about those words, layered in real breath, real passion, told her they hadn't come from a screen. She dialed Thomas Keller. Thomas, estate manager and longtime friend of the Beckfords, was the kind of man who kept everything in order: accounts, landscaping, even the comings and goings of visiting relatives. He was not easily rattled. When Rosa asked him to come in person, he arrived the next morning, dressed in gray slacks and a tie too formal for a Thursday. "You're telling me the parrot heard something?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm telling you it didn't learn those words from TV," Rosa replied, with Lydia out shopping and Mango serenading the garden with a medley of Sinatra. Thomas installed 2 discreet cameras. One aimed at the hallway outside the master bedroom. The other nestled in a bouquet vase overlooking the living room. Both were equipped with motion sensors and audio recording. They would only activate when the house was quiet, after midnight. Later that evening, Lydia returned. She was radiant, wrapped in a silk dress that shimmered like dusk. A small bag from a designer boutique dangled from her wrist. She passed Mango, who chirped, "Bonsoir, Ma Belle." She laughed, kissed him on the beak, and disappeared down the hall. At 2:17 a.m., the hallway camera stirred. Mango rustled in his cage. Lydia's bedroom door remained closed. But something about the stillness felt wrong. In the dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon through the window, Mango raised one claw, shifted his feathers, and spoke. "You're not supposed to be here, but I like it." The voice wasn't his. It was hers. Rosa, watching the live footage from a small screen tucked in the pantry, felt her pulse spike. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't an echo. It was a confession. And the bird was no longer just a pet. He was the memory of something forbidden. In his cage, Mango blinked slowly, as if he, too, understood the weight of the words he carried. And somewhere in the silence of that vast, luxurious home, the truth began to stretch its wings. Thomas spent the next morning in a peculiar state of tension, not overtly shaken, but carrying a stillness that weighed heavy behind his eyes. He had spent the previous night combing through hours of footage, but it was not the image that disturbed him. It was the sound, a soft thrum of forbidden intimacy that had no place in the quiet corridors of the Beckford estate. The first recording activated at 2:13 a.m. The frame showed nothing but the soft swaying of shadows on wallpaper, the hush of an air conditioner, the still cage where Mango slumbered with his head tucked beneath his wing. Then the audio came alive. A low male voice murmured something inaudible at first, followed by the unmistakable cadence of Lydia's laughter. And then, clear as a bell, came the words, "Lydia, you're crazy tonight." Thomas sat back in his chair, blood draining from his fingertips. The voice wasn't Henry's. It was lighter, less aged, more relaxed. It carried no trace of the clipped precision with which Mr. Beckford delivered every sentence. Even in private, this voice was familiar with Lydia, not through marriage, but through muscle memory. In the morning light, Rosa entered Thomas's office slowly, carrying a small notepad. She looked pale, as if she too had spent the night haunted by sounds without faces. "He said something new," she whispered. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Mango, just now, while I was making tea." She unfolded the paper and read aloud, "You better not repeat what I said." Thomas sighed, then leaned forward, placing both elbows on the desk. "And did Lydia say that?" She laughed when she did, like it was a joke. But Mango doesn't laugh. No, Thomas thought. Mango remembers. Later that afternoon, Thomas isolated the audio clip and filtered out the static. With professional software, he overlaid the waveform of Mango's repetition with Lydia's original voice. The results were nearly identical. Intonation, pitch, rhythm. The parrot had become an unintentional voice recorder, echoing everything that should have remained behind closed doors. And then came Marco. Thomas had started looking into Lydia's personal schedule, stored in the estate's cloud calendar. There he found entries labeled PT session, always mid-afternoon, 3 times a week. No further details, but gate logs showed the same car entering during those times, a silver BMW registered to one Marco Villarreal. Licensed personal trainer. Marco had no criminal record, no known associations with media or paparazzi, but his social media revealed a man too beautiful for discretion, shirtless selfies. Vague inspirational captions, a feed littered with flattery from female clients. But the comments from Lydia had been deleted. Thomas felt a cold resolve begin to settle. That night, he downloaded all the audio and video files to a secure USB. It took nearly an hour to compile and encrypt everything. He labeled the folder simply, Mango. He stared at the drive for a long while, debating whether to send it. Henry Beckford was in Tokyo, unreachable due to the time difference and tightly packed business meetings. Would it be reckless to send such personal content across continents? Or was it cowardly to wait? Finally, Thomas placed the USB into a sealed envelope, addressed in his neatest handwriting. Then he paused. One more clip to review. He clicked on the final file. The screen remained black, just audio. Lydia's voice again, a bit breathless, playful. "You think he'll ever find out?" Marco's voice, this time tinged with smugness. "Eric doesn't know anything, yet." Thomas froze. Eric, not Henry. He replayed the clip. "Eric doesn't know anything, yet." Thomas blinked. Had Marco confused the names? Or was Eric the real name of Henry Beckford? Or worse, was Lydia doing this with more than one man? 1,000 questions flooded in, each more damning than the last, but none as potent as the realization he had been slow to reach. Mango hadn't merely repeated one conversation. He had echoed many, different tones, different phrases, different names. Thomas closed his laptop, placed it on the desk, and stared at the birdcage in the monitor's background. Mango sat still, his head tilted, eye gleaming like a bead of glass. Innocent, observant, deadly, the bird had become an archive of secrets. And secrets, Thomas knew, were only ever dangerous when someone listened. Thomas sealed the padded envelope with a deliberation that felt heavier than the act required. The USB inside, labeled only with a small red dot and the initials, MB, held more than evidence. It held confessions, missteps, and the erosion of trust made flesh in audio and video bites. He addressed it to a private email used only by Eric Beckford, the alias Henry employed when working overseas. Few knew this, fewer were allowed to use it, but Thomas had once helped install a secure server during a security overhaul. And he remembered. He composed the message with care, short, clinical, and devoid of opinion. Subject: Security Review, Private Audio Visuals. Body: Files attached include footage and audio recorded per standard surveillance protocols. Strongly advise private review. Please confirm receipt. He encrypted the message with a password that only Eric would recognize, the name of his late dog. Followed by the year of Lydia and Eric's marriage. Then he hit send. The reply never came, but 12 hours later, at 3:22 a.m., Thomas received an automatic alert from the estate's internal system. Remote login initiated. Tokyo IP. User, EB. Eric had seen the files. No response. No rage. No commands. Just one text to Thomas's private phone: continue recording. Do not interfere. In the days that followed, Thomas kept to his task. Cameras remained hidden. Mics still nestled in vase necks and lamp bases. Lydia floated through the house. Unaware. She smiled. She gardened. She drank her morning juice while Mango, perched in his usual spot, chirped innocently, but he no longer sang Sinatra. Now he repeated Lydia's secrets. Like a child with no filter and no shame. Oh Marco. Just like that, he squawked mid-morning, startling Rosa so badly she dropped a glass. By the third day, Thomas had gathered clips that no longer merely hinted, they testified. One in particular burned into his mind: Marco tiptoeing from Lydia's bedroom. Hair mussed, shirt half-buttoned, kissing his fingers toward the cage as Mango crowed. Yes, 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 Marco. It was surreal. Theater written in feathers and glass. But what broke the dam was something far more human. Thomas, sleep-deprived and wired with unease, uploaded a snippet to a private folder on his cloud drive. A friend in his online poker group, a former audio engineer, had offered to clean up background distortion. Without thinking, Thomas dropped the clip into the group chat. Marked, "Check this weird parrot thing. Real voices. Not kidding." He meant to delete it an hour later. He forgot. By noon the next day, a new TikTok account had gone viral. Parrot Leaks uploaded a 23-second video titled, "The Parrot Who Knew Too Much." It showed Mango, vibrant and poised, repeating in perfect cadence, "Harder. Marco, you like that? Don't stop, baby." Then a jump cut to Marco emerging from a darkened hallway. The internet lost its mind. In 12 hours, the video garnered 8.4 million views. By sunrise the next day, #Parrot Challenge trended globally. Users mimicked Mango, dubbed scenes, turned the audio into remixes. One remix made it to Spotify. Another aired briefly on FM radio before being pulled. Comment sections exploded. No way that bird just outed an affair. Mango deserves his own reality show. She trained the bird to expose her. This is Shakespearean. Even news outlets picked up the story. When Pets Know Too Much headlined one morning talk show segment. Mango became a meme, a GIF, a virtual pet in an app within 72 hours. Lydia hadn't seen the video yet, but Thomas did, and so did Eric. His plane landed the following afternoon. No announcement, no chauffeurs. He stepped off the gate alone, dressed in a black overcoat and leather gloves despite the California sun. He didn't go home. Instead, he checked into a discreet hotel under his real name. That night, 3 private investigators entered the Beckford estate posing as IT technicians. They carried briefcases, notepads, and silent faces. Thomas let them in. In the study, Mango tilted his head. Eric doesn't know anything, yet. The investigators said nothing. One of them took out a pen and wrote the phrase down in block letters. They weren't here for justice. They were here for precision. Eric had returned, not as a husband, but as a strategist, and the board was now set. It began with a ripple, barely noticeable, a whisper of laughter shared in corners of the internet. A short clip stitched together with irony and disbelief. But like all things in the digital age, it took only a spark to ignite an inferno. Within 24 hours, TikTok became the stage for a parody that swept across the globe. The original video was less than 30 seconds. Mango, perched with exaggerated elegance on his swing, delivered the damning phrase in perfect clarity, "Harder, Marco." The audio had been trimmed to capture just that line, followed by a dramatic zoom on the parrot's face, and then a cut to black with the caption, "The bird knows everything." The response was immediate. Influencers began mimicking the parrot's voice, lip-syncing its scandalous lines while dressed in bird costumes or seated in mock luxury mansions. Teenagers created dance challenges with voiceovers, their captions veering between dark humor and disbelief. Even comedians and voice actors jumped in, recreating elaborate parrot confessionals, exaggerating the drama with theatrical flair. Lydia Beckford, once known in affluent circles for her tasteful charity galas and designer fashion, was suddenly the internet's favorite joke. Memes began surfacing, her face Photoshop onto parrots, viral sounds remixed with club beats. "Harder, Marco" trended on Instagram Reels, then on YouTube Shorts, and eventually even on late-night comedy segments. She had become a symbol of unintentional comedy, her private life shredded and repackaged for mass amusement. Marco's name quickly surfaced. Internet sleuths dug into public court records, revealing a previous civil suit involving inappropriate conduct with a former client. While the case had been dismissed, the implications were enough. Fitness companies and lifestyle brands he had modeled for quietly removed his images. One gym revoked his promotional contract within hours. But perhaps the cruelest twist belonged to Lydia's charitable foundation. For years, she had served as the face of Hope for Harmony, a nonprofit supporting displaced animals. Sponsors, wary of scandal, pulled their funding. Press releases cited a need to reassess our affiliations amid ongoing media disruption. Meanwhile, Mango had transcended species and status. The parrot was invited, though not literally, to appear on a popular daytime talk show, where hosts replayed his audio clips to riotous applause. The phrase, "from pet to prosecutor," became a headline in national tabloids. Merchandise was soon printed. T-shirts with Mango's face, coffee mugs that read "He heard everything," even plush toys that repeated the infamous lines. Lydia vanished. The once vibrant estate shuttered its gates. Curtains drawn, garden untended, her Range Rover unmoved in weeks. She neither confirmed nor denied anything. No statements, no interviews. Her absence only fueled further speculation. Drone footage even captured someone, perhaps Lydia, moving inside the mansion wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. Eric, the man once in Tokyo, returned with no drama, no press conference, just a swift legal filing. The divorce was finalized quietly, but with one unusual clause that caught the attention of gossip blogs: full custody of Mango was granted to Eric. When pressed by reporters, he declined to elaborate, but the image of Eric leaving court with a simple cage in hand, Mango preening proudly, circulated widely. Some called it poetic, others called it justice. A long-form article was published in The Atlantic, "The Bird That Knew Too Much." It dissected not just the scandal but the phenomenon it sparked, how society treats digital truth, the ethics of privacy, and the randomness of what becomes viral. Mango was hailed as both hero and symptom. And then, the final evolution: Hollywood came calling. A documentary company known for its slick, emotionally manipulative productions announced the acquisition of rights to the story. Working title: Parrot Gate, When Love Gets Repeated. Streaming platforms entered a bidding war. Rumors of A-list actors voicing the parrot in animated reenactments circulated. But beyond the headlines and hashtags, there was something quieter. Mango, who had never asked for fame, sat in his new home, watching the rain streak the windows. Sometimes he spoke, often he didn't. Eric placed the cage beside his reading chair. He'd pause, sip his tea, and simply listen, because now the world knew what Thomas had known all along. The house had never been silent. It just took a parrot to make everyone hear. When the world turned its back on Lydia Beckford, she did not issue a statement. She didn't upload a Notes app apology or retreat to a wellness retreat in Bali. She simply vanished. Her once glowing social media profiles fell silent, no stories, no posts, no birthday acknowledgements. Rumors whispered that she had moved to Portugal, to a villa near the coast where no one recognized her name or parrot-infused scandal. No one knew for sure. And perhaps, that's exactly how she wanted it. Meanwhile, Mango had a new life. Eric Beckford, whose stoic face had haunted the divorce court photographs, turned out to be a surprisingly tender guardian. He set up a custom perch near the sunniest window of his new townhouse, laid down pine bedding, bought Mango imported birdseed blends, and played classical music in the afternoons. The parrot, who had once been a silent witness to betrayal, was now an adored companion. Eric even set up a small humidifier nearby, mimicking the tropical climate Mango would have once known in the wild. But Mango wasn't just adjusting, he was ascending. A PR agency approached Eric with the idea of turning Mango into a brand. They launched an official Instagram page, @MangoTheWhistleblower. The bio read, "He heard everything. And now so will you." The account quickly amassed followers, half amused, half reverent. Photos of Mango posing next to vintage typewriters, sipping bird-safe tea, and wearing tiny felt hats flooded the feed. And then came the live stream. It was meant to be simple, just a 15-minute Q&A with Mango squawking occasionally in the background. But then Mango tilted his head, fluffed his wings, and said it, "Marco. He's gone, baby." The phrase hit the chat like a lightning strike. Comments exploded. The moment was clipped and reshared across all platforms. People called it closure. Others called it genius. The phrase trended again. "He's gone, baby." A cafe in Los Angeles renamed one of their drinks after it, the Marco Latte, with a parrot whisper. It was an oat milk concoction topped with foam art shaped like feathers. Tourists lined up to taste Betrayal disguised as froth. Marco, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely. His contract at the gym was terminated. His old profiles, Instagram, LinkedIn, even Venmo, vanished within a week of the scandal breaking. There were theories, of course. Some believed he moved to South America. Others suggested he changed his name and was working as a barista in Boston. But no hard evidence ever surfaced. Eric, for his part, chose not to chase vengeance. Instead, he directed his energy into something meaningful, a national campaign called Digital Infidelity Awareness. It focused on protecting digital privacy in relationships, on recognizing red flags, and, ironically, on the emotional toll of smart devices and surveillance tech. Mango, of course, became the official mascot. At one press conference, Eric was asked why he kept Mango. He looked down at the cage beside him and said, simply, he told the truth when no one else would. Lydia, attempting to salvage what was left of her dignity, filed a lawsuit citing invasion of privacy and emotional distress. But the court dismissed the case. The footage had been captured within a home that legally belonged to Eric, with devices installed for security purposes. Her public downfall was deemed the result of her own actions, and the world's obsession with virality. And so Mango continued, not just as a pet or a symbol, but as a presence. He was invited to a school in Connecticut where students studied ethics and honesty. The principal had read the Atlantic article and believed Mango's story could teach children the lasting power of truth, even when it came feathered. At the closing ceremony of the campaign's first year, Mango sat on a velvet-covered perch beside Eric on stage. The lights were warm, the room full, and just before the final applause, Mango spoke. "Some secrets aren't secrets forever," he said, then paused, "especially when your parrot has a perfect memory." The crowd erupted, because in a world where trust is a currency, sometimes the loudest truth comes from the quietest place. And some birds, they never stop talking. Eleanor Beck sat propped up in her recliner near the French windows. A woman molded by nearly 9 decades of time, reduced now to silence. Her eyes, once commanding and vibrant, were dulled by age, but not extinguished. After her stroke, her body failed her, one side paralyzed, her mouth unable to form words, But her mind, tucked away in its stubborn fortress, remained intact. No one asked, no one suspected, they simply assumed. To her daughter-in-law Laura, Eleanor was nothing more than an inert presence. Something to be fed, repositioned, and ignored. The way Laura glanced at her, dismissive, detached, was as if Eleanor were no longer human, just another antique in the mansion that collected dust and sentiment. Every morning, Laura would wheel Eleanor to the window, let the light pour onto her faded nightgown, and leave her there like a forgotten painting. Eleanor blinked. It was the only thing she could still do without strain, and she did it often. Not in patterns, not for communication, no one would have noticed if she had. But she blinked to herself, to remember she still could, and to mark time, because in that silence, time was all she had. Time, and a front row seat. Jacob, her son, was a busy man, a builder of empires, he liked to call himself. But the truth was simpler. He was old, tired, and infatuated with his second wife. Laura was 35, with cascading brunette hair, a waist made for silk, and a smile that could delay a man's judgment. She had been charming during the courtship, doting after the wedding, and performatively kind to Eleanor when Jacob was present. But when he left on business, always some conference in Dubai, a negotiation in Munich, Laura became herself again. Felix entered the picture like a summer breeze, young, sun-kissed, and muscular in the way that made Laura tilt her head when he walked by. Officially, he was the gardener. Unofficially, he was Laura's daily distraction. She called him in around tea time, though no tea was ever served. The front door would creak at 4, and by 4:15, they'd be in the sitting room, just a few steps from Eleanor's chair. Eleanor sat, her breathing shallow, her eyes half-lidded. She saw Laura's hands slide under Felix's shirt, heard the whispering, the giggles, the occasional gasp muffled by velvet cushions. Laura rarely even turned Eleanor's chair away. What was the point? The old woman couldn't move, couldn't tell, couldn't do anything, except blink. Sometimes, in the deepest shadows of twilight, the housemaid, young Anya, would walk in and catch Eleanor's gaze pointed not at the garden, but straight at the couch. Anya would freeze, heart thudding, a chill of recognition slipping down her spine. But she said nothing. Perhaps she feared the consequences. Perhaps she told herself it was a trick of light. But Eleanor knew. Every clumsy kiss, every breathless embrace, it all unfolded before her like a cruel stage play performed in the theater of her forced stillness. Then one night, it escalated. The house was silent. Jacob was in Tokyo. The hallway was dark except for a sliver of moonlight crawling across the hardwood floors. Eleanor lay half covered in her blanket, still as always. Laura and Felix didn't whisper this time. They didn't sneak. They made love on the couch. Loud and messy, just 10 feet from the woman they believed to be comatose. And that was the night Eleanor blinked, once. Then again, eyes wide open. Her pulse didn't change. Her breath remained calm, but a sharpness returned to her gaze. Something old and buried. She had waited long enough. Because there was something else in that room. Something Laura and Felix had forgotten. The silk pillow beneath Eleanor's fragile head. Inside it, stitched with care by a loyal friend from the past, long dead, long forgotten, was a tiny recording device. Voice-activated, nearly invisible, and it had been listening. From the very first whisper to the very last lie. And Eleanor, she was never asleep, she was never absent, she was the woman in the corner who blinked, and never missed a thing. When Eleanor passed away, the house grew quieter, but not in the way one might expect. Her death was not a dramatic affair. There were no final words, no tearful goodbyes, no dramatic gasps for forgiveness. It was a soft departure, a second stroke that came in the middle of the night, barely waking the nurse who checked on her every 3 hours. She was 92, her skin like delicate parchment, her breathing already slow and fragile in the weeks leading up to it. When the doctor confirmed her passing, the staff and family simply nodded. They had seen it coming. The funeral was private and understated. A few old acquaintances came out of respect. But most of her world had already passed on before her. Laura wore black, dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and stood by Jacob's side with a solemn grace that many thought was noble. But to those who paid closer attention, if anyone had dared to, it was clear her sorrow was rehearsed. There was a barely concealed lightness to her posture, a release that fluttered through her gestures like a woman who had just been unchained. Jacob, for his part, was grief-stricken in a quiet, inward way. He had always been a man of order, not drama. His mother had raised him that way. He gave a short eulogy at the church, simple, heartfelt, a man trying to keep his heart from cracking open. He did not know yet that everything he thought he had buried with his mother was, in fact, about to rise from the grave. 1 week after the funeral, as rain streaked the tall windows of the Beckford estate, Jacob received a call from the family lawyer, Mr. Remington. He was an old man with a hunched back and a voice like gravel. But he carried with him the weight of every truth that families like the Beckfords tried to bury. He asked for a private meeting, per Eleanor's wishes. He had said, when he arrived, he brought with him a sealed envelope and a small, ordinary-looking USB drive. They sat in Jacob's study, mahogany panels, shelves lined with unread first editions. The air scented faintly with old pipe smoke, and Jacob opened the envelope. Inside was a note, written in Eleanor's hand, still sharp and elegant. If you are seeing this, it means I am gone. But I was never absent. The truth is heavier than silence. Listen. Jacob looked up at Mr. Remington, who nodded. With slightly trembling hands, Jacob inserted the USB into his laptop and opened the file. He expected a message, perhaps a loving goodbye, perhaps some cryptic remark about how to live well or forgive easily. What he got instead was a recording. The sound was unmistakable. At first, there was just the ambient hum of the living room, the creak of a sofa cushion, the rustle of fabric. Then came the voices. Laura's voice, high, teasing, breathy. Felix's voice, younger, cockier, a man who thought the walls could not hear him. They laughed, whispered, moaned. They used each other's names. They described what they were doing in detail that made Jacob's stomach turn. The timestamp was from a night Jacob remembered clearly. He had been in Boston for a business meeting. He recalled Laura saying she had spent the evening reading by the fire. And yet, here was her voice, just feet away from Eleanor's bed. Not reading, not mourning, but reveling in betrayal. More recordings followed, each one a different day. Different sounds. Sometimes the soft rustle of sheets. Other times, the unmistakable rhythm of bodies colliding. Always with Eleanor present, and always with the same dismissive cruelty. She's just a corpse with a pulse. Laura laughed in one recording. I could dance naked and she wouldn't blink. But the recordings told a different story. There were moments, faint but there, where Eleanor's breathing changed. A subtle hitch, a long pause, once, even, a quiet gasp, and at the very end of the final file, a new voice entered the recording. It was raspy, fragile, but steady. Jacob, Eleanor said, don't let that woman take another inch. Not another inch. It was the first time Jacob had heard her speak in almost a year. He froze. Mr. Remington, quiet beside him, finally spoke. She had that microphone sewn into her pillow. Sir, special order. Months ago. Jacob closed the laptop. He did not weep. He did not scream. He stood up slowly, placed the USB back into the envelope, and looked out the window toward the garden where Laura liked to spend her afternoons. There was a stillness to him now. A terrifying, focused stillness. Thank you, Mr. Remington, he said, voice low. Let's begin the paperwork. She won't keep a single cent. And so, with the quiet rage of a man whose last illusion had just shattered, Jacob Beckford prepared for war, with a ghost at his back. And the truth in his hands. Laura slammed her hand down on the kitchen counter, sending a porcelain mug clattering to the floor. This is fake. It has to be. But Jacob didn't even flinch. He sat at the head of the dining table, the USB drive resting before him like a judge's gavel. His face was unreadable. his eyes hollowed out not by anger, but by something colder, resolve. "The audio was verified this morning," he said flatly, "by 2 forensic specialists. Time-stamped, unaltered, and it goes back months." Laura. Months. Laura's lawyer, a smooth-faced man in an ill-fitting suit, tried to regain control. "We dispute the credibility of the recording. Mrs. Beckford was not of sound mind. And if this was indeed placed in a personal item, there are issues of privacy." "Your client," Jacob interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, "had sex with another man on a couch 3 feet from my dying mother. She mocked her, laughed at her, and the only person with decency in that room was unconscious." The silence that followed was not one of defeat, but of growing dread. Laura had always considered herself a survivor, a strategist. She had married an older man for stability, calculated her every move in the social circuit, climbed the ladder with the precision of someone who knew exactly how far charm could take her. But she had never imagined this. She thought Eleanor was just an obstacle, a piece of fading flesh tucked into a corner. She never expected that the old woman's pillow had been listening, that the frail body had carried enough wit, enough fire, to record everything she couldn't speak. Jacob filed for divorce that afternoon. The grounds were clear: infidelity, emotional cruelty, and moral abandonment. But it wasn't just about dissolving a marriage. It was about reclaiming dignity, about honoring a mother whose final act was one of defiant truth. The estate's legal team moved fast. They petitioned to revoke Laura's ownership of shared assets, including the Beckford home, which she had decorated with such pride. They moved to strip her of stock shares Jacob had gifted during their 2nd anniversary. Even her name was to be removed from the foundation she had once posed beside for glossy charity magazine covers. Laura's legal team attempted a weak defense. Eleanor was not mentally sound. She had suffered 2 strokes. How could any evidence collected by her be credible? But the medical records were damning. Nurses had written detailed logs about Eleanor's lucid moments, about how she blinked in response to questions, how she would squeeze hands with subtle strength. And then there was the custom invoice, proof of a specialty microphone sewn into her orthopedic pillow. Ordered months prior, paid for in cash. It was clear Eleanor had planned this. Then came the media. Somehow, as it always does, the story leaked. The pillow confession. Headlines screamed. Daytime talk shows ran dramatic reenactments. Podcasts dissected the ethics of spy recording within households. TikTok exploded with audio remixes of Laura's moans and the parrot-like repetition of her betrayal. It became internet spectacle, tragedy dressed as comedy. A short audio clip from the USB surfaced online. "She's just a corpse with a pulse." Laura's voice sneered. It was retweeted over 1 million times. Her name trended for 3 days straight. Endorsement deals she had with lifestyle brands vanished overnight. Her PR agency dropped her. Felix, the once adoring lover, fled. Word spread he had gone back to a small town in the south. Deleted all social accounts. Disappeared like a shadow at noon. In the courtroom, Jacob remained silent. He wore a dark suit, no tie. He brought the pillow, not as a prop, but as a symbol. It sat beside him during the hearings. The judge took note. When the verdict was read, it came with stunning clarity. The recordings were deemed admissible. They were made on private property, inside a privately owned home, on a device belonging to the decedent. Laura had no expectation of privacy in that living room. The evidence stood. The court ruled in favor of Jacob. Laura was ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours. No compensation, no alimony, no stake in the business. She walked out with a suitcase and a pair of sunglasses that could no longer shield her from the public eye. As she stepped into the waiting car, reporters swarmed. Microphones pushed forward. One asked, cruelly, "Do you have anything to say to Mrs. Beckford?" Laura didn't answer. For the first time in years, she understood what silence meant. Not absence, but judgment. Jacob, meanwhile, returned to the estate. He stood in the hallway where so much had unfolded, placed the pillow gently on his mother's empty bed, and whispered, "Thank you." Justice had not come with noise. It had come with a whisper from the dead. After the verdict was delivered and Laura walked out of the courtroom stripped of everything she had once called hers, the Beckford estate became an entirely different place. It no longer buzzed with soft laughter, footsteps echoing down polished halls, or the scent of expensive candles Laura used to favor. Now, it echoed only with silence, one thick and patient, like fog settling in a valley. Laura left without a final word. There were no dramatics, no pleas for forgiveness, no performance of sorrow. She stepped into the waiting car under the gaze of a few curious neighbors and a scattering of local press. Lips tight, sunglasses covering whatever emotion, if any, flickered in her eyes. Her departure wasn't just from the estate. It was from the story, from the world she had once curated so carefully. Like a fallen actress exiting the final act, she vanished behind the curtain of disgrace. Jacob remained. He did not remarry. He did not sell the house. Instead, he chose to dwell in its emptied corridors, each room a chamber of echoing memory. The estate felt like a mausoleum now, a grand tomb built not just for Eleanor, but for everything Jacob had once believed about love, loyalty, and legacy. The house had once been alive with routines and rituals, shared breakfasts, gentle touch, unspoken gestures. Now, it had become a space that listened more than it spoke. He never touched Eleanor's room. The same floral drapes Laura had once called old-fashioned, still hung beside the wide window. The same pillow, now legendary, still lay on the bed, a permanent fixture, never fluffed, never moved. Every morning, Jacob would enter that room, sit by her bedside, and stay in silence for several minutes. No one knew exactly what he did there, or what he might have been listening for, but in his stillness, there was purpose. Eleanor's voice had not truly left. It lingered, not just in memory, but in sound. The new housekeeper, a quiet woman named Marla, once whispered to the gardener that, some nights, a soft sound would emerge from the old intercom Eleanor had installed years ago. Not music, not static, a phrase, carried like breath through vents and wires. It was always the same. Jacob, don't let that woman take another inch. At first, Marla thought it a malfunction, a looped recording, but the voice felt timed, deliberate, as though it spoke only when the house had fallen entirely still. As if the house, somehow, remembered. The phrase became more than a haunting. It became a kind of mantra. It was printed on bumper stickers, shared in memes, whispered in advocacy circles, for women silenced in their later years, for the elderly ignored in their own homes. Eleanor became a symbol of defiant remembrance. The internet, so often a vessel of mockery, treated her with reverence. Jacob founded a small but passionate organization, the Silent Witness Fund. Its mission was to empower elderly women, especially those without family, to legally protect their assets, ensure proper representation, and document their voices. Even when the world stopped listening, he poured resources into the cause, declining all interviews but quietly funding scholarships, legal aid clinics, and support centers. He never used Eleanor's story to promote the fund. But everyone knew, everyone understood. The media didn't forget. One headline from a national publication captured the sensation. She never spoke in life, but she screamed in death. A week after the story went viral, a film production company acquired the rights. They announced a miniseries to be titled, The Pillow That Testified. Writers speculated, actresses auditioned, but none of them could quite capture Eleanor's silence, the depth of it, the density, and in the heart of it all, in a glass case set within a quiet alcove of the estate, rested the pillow. It was untouched, protected behind thick glass, and displayed without drama. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "Property of Eleanor Beckford. Witness to truth." It was the only thing Laura had not tried to take, the only thing she had no right to claim. And now, it belonged not just to Jacob, or to the house. It belonged to history, to every woman who was ever unheard, to every voice that had waited, patiently, for its moment to rise from silence and speak the unshakable truth. 1 year had passed since Eleanor Beckford's voice, carried through a pillow, shifted the course of lives. Jacob, now grey not only in hair but in soul, quietly stepped away from the public eye. He sold off minor properties, cut ties with corporate boards, and left the towering Beckford estate behind. In its place, he chose solitude, a small lakeside home tucked beneath maple trees that blushed red in autumn and whispered secrets to the wind. He brought with him very little: a battered leather chair, a ceramic mug that had once been Eleanor's, and the infamous pillow, its case freshly laundered but still infused with the invisible weight of what it had once heard. It sat on the same chair Eleanor had once watched birds from. Now placed beside the living room window, Jacob never touched it except to dust it, and even then, with reverence. In the silence of that lakeside home, Jacob began to write. It started as a way to process the unbearable quiet. But soon, words found rhythm, and rhythm gave birth to chapters. The book he completed 6 months later was titled, The Quiet Betrayal, A Husband, a Pillow, and a Truth No One Heard. To everyone's surprise, including Jacob's, the book became a bestseller. It resonated not as scandal, but as scripture. The prose was restrained, gentle, never accusatory. Jacob wrote not to destroy Laura, but to remember Eleanor. The world, it seemed, had grown hungry for stories where justice came not with shouting, but with stillness. Critics described it as painfully elegant, and a meditation on how silence can roar louder than rage. Letters poured in, not emails, real letters. Handwritten, tear-stained, sent from retirement homes and hospital beds. From women who had long since given up being listened to. They thanked him, not for the drama, but for giving voice to a generation that had been made invisible. One woman wrote, "I used to talk to my sewing machine. Now I talk to my lawyer. Thank your mother." Jacob read every single one. Meanwhile, Laura had disappeared, not in the criminal sense. There had been no formal charges. But she vanished from tabloids and search engines alike. Rumor had it she worked at a sleepy cafe in New Hampshire. Her blonde hair dyed dark, her lips rarely painted. Someone posted a blurry photo once, a woman, head bowed, wiping tables while a French song played softly in the background. The same song she had once danced to in the living room with Felix. She didn't give interviews, didn't write tell-alls. If anything, her punishment was silence, not imposed, but inherited, the kind that grows from seeds of betrayal, watered daily by regret. Jacob never mentioned her again. He had stopped keeping track of her long ago. Instead, he poured his attention into the lavender bushes outside his window, pruning them just as Eleanor once had. He donated anonymously to elderly advocacy groups. And each year, on Eleanor's birthday, he placed the pillow on the deck chair, opened a worn audio file, and sat in quiet vigil. Once, his granddaughter, 10 and inquisitive, asked about the pillow. Did great-grandma really say that? Just once. Jacob looked at her. Once is all it takes. He said, if it's the truth. And the truth did remain. In the pillow, in the book, in the legacy of a whisper that refused to die quietly. The story closed, not with a bang, but a breath. And yet, that breath stirred winds in homes, in courtrooms, in hearts that had waited too long to be heard. Not every weapon is loud. Some are stitched with feathers. Even the voiceless leave echoes. Especially when the truth matters enough. Lucas had always known he was different. Not in the obvious ways. He was unremarkably handsome, with kind, tired eyes and hands roughened by honest work, but in the way certain places spoke to him. Not loudly, not with words, but with a familiarity so deep it tugged at the edges of memory he didn't recall making. So when he first laid eyes on the old French-style villa nestled quietly in the misty suburbs of Chanteloun, he didn't hesitate. The wrought iron gates creaked open with a sound that felt like an echo. Not of something he'd heard before, but of something he'd once felt. He walked up the stone path lined with lavender and weathered statues, his boots brushing against fallen petals. Something in his chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. The job listing had been simple: seeking full-time gardener. Discretion and attention to detail required. Room provided. No photos. No names. But when he arrived, the house seemed to rise from the earth like it had been waiting. And so had she. Eleanor Beaumont, Elle, as she insisted, was not what Lucas had expected. At 28, she carried the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Her beauty was not delicate but deliberate, porcelain skin, dark eyes that seemed to weigh every word before it left her lips, and an ever-present smudge of dust on her fingers from restoring something old. She'd inherited the estate from her great-grandmother, a woman Lucas had never met but somehow felt had once known him. Elle was skeptical at first. She had interviewed others, more qualified perhaps, but none had looked at the garden the way Lucas did. He walked among the roses not as a laborer, but as someone visiting old friends. Within hours, he had identified herbs growing wild behind the greenhouse and trimmed the ivy from the marble sundial without being told. When she asked how he knew to do that, he only shrugged and said, "It felt right." In truth, Lucas didn't understand it either. He had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes and schools, never putting down roots. He wasn't trained in horticulture, but in the first week at the Beaumont estate, he restored a decaying hedge maze with the precision of someone who'd designed it. Elle began to watch him from the windows. At first, it was curiosity, then fascination, then something gentler. She noticed the way he moved, deliberate and patient, as though tending to memories, not just plants. He sang quietly to himself sometimes, old, melodic lines from no song she could place. At night, Lucas dreamed, always the same, a garden in full bloom under a twilight sky, a woman in a green velvet dress, and himself in an old-fashioned waistcoat. They met under the rose-covered trellis, laughing softly, fingers tangled like vines. He always woke before she turned her face fully to him. One morning, over tea in the kitchen, Elle asked about his past. He hesitated, then told her the truth. Orphaned as a baby. No known relatives. No records of birth beyond a name and a date. She looked at him as if seeing something she hadn't before, not pity, but a puzzle piece clicking into place. Their connection deepened. It wasn't dramatic, but subtle. Shared glances. The exchange of books. The way Elle began leaving out an extra teacup. Lucas found himself humming when she passed by, unconsciously, and Elle, though she rarely smiled, would sometimes linger near the garden bench where he sat to sketch plant patterns. It was during one of the spring rains that she finally invited him inside, not to the grand parlor or formal dining room, but to the basement. It was where she kept pieces waiting for restoration. That day, she was cataloging old portraits stored in dust cloths. Lucas followed her down the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath their feet. The basement smelled of time, of paper, cedar, and fading varnish, and there, propped against the far wall, was a large canvas. Elle pulled the cloth away slowly, revealing a painting dated 1920. The colors were muted but clear, a man in a dark vest and tie, standing in the same garden Lucas tended daily. His hair was slicked back, his posture proud, but it was the face that stole the breath from Lucas's lungs. It was his face, not similar, not reminiscent. It was him, down to the slope of the brow, the curve of the jaw, the scar near the temple. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the distant thunder above. Elle stepped closer, her fingers hovering near the canvas. His name was Julian Darcy, she whispered. He was my great-grandmother's fiancé. He disappeared before the wedding. No one ever found out why. Lucas stared at the man he had never met, and yet, somehow, had always been. The garden above their heads felt heavier. The air shifted. Something had been waiting beneath the roots, beneath the years, and now, it had awakened. He touched the frame. A memory, not his, flickered, a rose pressed into a book. A voice saying, "Promise me, you'll come back." Then it was gone. Elle looked at him, eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. "Lucas, who are you?" He didn't have the answer, but in his chest, something ancient stirred, and it whispered, "You've always been here." Outside, the rain softened. In the garden, the first rose of the season bloomed. And deep in the soil, a story prepared to repeat itself. In the dim, musky air of the basement, the dust danced like slow snowflakes in the glow of a single swinging bulb. Elle stepped carefully down the stone steps, the silence wrapping around her like a shawl. She hadn't been down here since the move. Most of the old furniture and artifacts from her great-grandmother's time were boxed up, forgotten in the shadows. But today, something tugged at her, a curiosity she couldn't name. Lucas followed her down, his boots making soft, deliberate echoes against the cold floor. He held the small lantern they'd found earlier. Its light revealed carved trunks, rusted birdcages, cracked porcelain dolls, the remnants of another life. Elle moved toward a cloth-covered canvas leaning against the far wall. The fabric, once white, had gone the color of dried bones. She touched it, fingers trembling slightly, and began to pull the cover free. What emerged took her breath. A man in formal 1920s attire stared out from the painting. Eyes deep and enigmatic, he wore a dark vest, his hand resting lightly on a cane. Behind him bloomed a wall of roses, eerily similar to the trellis in her own garden. But it was the face, his face, that made Elle step back. The resemblance to Lucas wasn't just uncanny, it was almost impossible. Same sharp jawline, same eyes, melancholic, intelligent, burdened. Lucas approached slowly, puzzled by her expression. When she turned the canvas toward him, he froze. The lantern slipped slightly in his grip. "I've been here," he whispered, so softly she barely heard it. "I've stood exactly here." His voice held no playfulness, no disbelief, only the weight of recognition. Elle stared between him and the painting, her heart thudding. She had always been a skeptic, of spirits, of reincarnation, of anything that couldn't be filed under logic. But Lucas was pale now, visibly shaken, and his eyes shimmered with something between fear and awe. He stepped forward, brushing his fingers over the brushstrokes. This was the garden, before the renovations, and her. He pointed beyond the painted roses, to a woman whose figure barely emerged from shadow. "She used to sing to me. I remember a song about swallows and winter rain." Elle's mouth went dry. She pulled the canvas back against the wall, her hand trembling. The signature at the bottom caught her eye, Ida Marais. Her great-grandmother, the woman who had vanished in 1923 without a trace. The painting was dated a year earlier, 1922. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He wandered the grounds under the pale light of a half-moon, fingers trailing the vines along the old trellis. The dreams had returned in pieces, fragments that fluttered like moths too fast to catch. A kiss stolen under a veil of roses. Blood on his shirt. A man's shout. A scream that didn't sound like fear, but betrayal. In the morning, he sat in the garden, fingernails caked with dirt, staring at the sky. Elle brought him tea and crouched beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, "I think I've done this before. All of it." "Lucas, you said you grew up in a group home. Is it possible you saw the painting somewhere? Maybe read about this place?" "No." His eyes found hers, unwavering. "I didn't know this estate existed until I walked up to the gate. But my body, my bones, they remember. I knew the path to the east wall before I'd ever seen it. And last night, I dreamt of the fountain, the one buried under the hedges." Elle felt her spine chill. There was an old foundation beneath the hedges. Her great-grandmother's diary had mentioned it once. In passing, no maps, no photos, just a memory. Later that day, Lucas was working near the rose garden when his spade struck something hard. A round, metallic clink. He knelt, brushed away the soil. It was a rusted piece of jewelry, an old locket. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was a photo of Ida Marais, and the same man from the painting. Elle, watching from the veranda, couldn't breathe. That evening, she scoured the attic for her family's genealogical records, pulling out brittle papers, old letters, and a few journals. Most were in French, Faded with time. One note. Translated roughly. Read. Louis disappeared last summer. They said he ran, but I know better. He told me he would wait. Even in another life. I painted him in the roses. I wanted the world to see his face one more time before it was taken from me. Lucas stood behind her, the locket in his hand. That was me, he said. I feel it. Do you believe in reincarnation? She asked. I didn't, until now. The next morning, Lucas woke with a start. He had dreamed of blood again, this time vivid. He stood behind the rose arbor, yelling at someone. There was a scuffle. He was pushed. Something pierced his side. Then the roses turned red. When he looked at his arm, a thin scratch ran from his elbow to wrist. He didn't remember getting it. Didn't know how it had bled onto the sheets. Elle's hands trembled as she helped him wrap the wound. They no longer talked about, if only, what next. The garden watched them. The past breathed between the petals. And somewhere under the soil, a story long buried began to bloom again. The days that followed blurred like brushstrokes in rain. Time stretched and contracted, folding over itself in ways Elle couldn't grasp. Her mind was filled with fragments, Lucas's stare at the painting. The dreams, the locket buried in the earth. Something ancient had begun to stir, and it refused to be ignored. Lucas changed, or perhaps, Elle realized, he was simply shedding the version of himself that had been borrowed for this life. His words grew strange, tinged with a cadence from another era. He would call her Ma Kerry in a way that felt instinctive. He spoke of promises made in twilight gardens and of running barefoot across dewy grass beneath the stars. One morning, he looked at her with eyes full of tears and whispered, "You said you'd come back for me. And I waited." Elle began journaling, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Her entries were raw, confessions of fear and longing, of doubt and yearning. She documented every odd phrase Lucas uttered, every inexplicable moment. She started comparing them with the diary entries and letters she'd found in the attic. The overlap was unnerving. Then came the letter. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out book, brittle and yellowed, written in delicate script. It was from her great-grandmother to someone named Elle. The lines spoke of forbidden meetings, of shared dreams and whispered plans. But one phrase stopped Elle cold. "We made a vow under the roses. If this life separates us, I'll find you in the next." It was almost identical to something Lucas had said in his sleep just nights earlier. That day, Elle walked through the garden with trembling hands. The trellis of roses Lucas had carefully cultivated now arched exactly as it had in the painting. It wasn't merely similar, it was identical. The color, the curvature, the way the vines curled like fingers around the posts. It was as if he'd rebuilt the memory, petal by petal. The dreams returned to Elle, too, vivid and startling. In them, she was dressed in a flowing cream gown, running through the garden with blood on her hands. She looked over her shoulder in terror, not at Lucas, but at someone else, always unseen, but always near. One evening, as the moon began its slow climb into a cloudless sky, Lucas approached her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "You need to leave," he said. Elle blinked. "What? Why?" He looked away, jaw clenched. "Something's coming. I don't know what exactly, but I feel it, in my bones, in the earth beneath our feet. It's tied to the full moon. You can't be here." She refused. "No, you're not pushing me away again. Not in this life. If something is coming, we face it together." Lucas stared at her then, long and hard, as if trying to determine whether she was truly who he remembered. Finally, he whispered, "You left before. You promised. And you left." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't remember, but I'm here now. Doesn't that count for something?" He nodded slowly, a man caught between past and present. Thunder cracked across the sky, sudden, unnatural. The wind stirred violently, though the trees hadn't moved all day. Lucas turned from her without another word, walking toward the tool shed. Moments later, he emerged holding a rusted spade. It was old, older than anything Elle recognized, and she had never seen it before. The iron was pitted and worn, the wood dark with age and something else, something that looked like dried blood. Elle watched him disappear into the roses, the spade in hand. The moonlight kissed the garden with a silver sheen, and for a breathless moment, the past seemed to fold into the present. In the silence, Elle whispered a name she didn't know she remembered. Louis. Somewhere, the roses trembled, and the story they thought had ended was only now beginning again. The first sound Elle heard was the faint thud of metal striking earth. It was subtle, almost rhythmic, like a metronome counting down toward something inevitable. She blinked awake in the dark, heart pounding, and turned to the window. Outside, bathed in moonlight that turned the garden silver, Lucas was digging beneath the arched trellis of roses. He moved methodically, shoveling the soil in solemn repetition, as though he were unearthing something sacred, or cursed. Elle pushed herself out of bed, threw on a robe, and slipped down the stairs barefoot. The door creaked open, cool air licking at her skin. "Lucas," she called softly. He didn't answer. His eyes, when she reached him, were vacant, distant, fixed on the dirt like a man in trance. She grabbed his arm. He flinched but did not resist. The moon cast pale shadows across his face, and he looked older in that light. Or perhaps simply eternal. With a final strike, the spade hit wood. They both froze. Lucas dropped to his knees, fingers trembling as he brushed away layers of earth. Slowly, he unearthed a weathered wooden box. Its hinges rusted, corners swollen with age. He opened it. Inside were fragments of bone, brittle and pale, tangled in decayed velvet lining. A necklace lay among them, its chain dulled by time but still intact. And beneath it, a piece of parchment, soaked in something brown and stiff with age. Lucas stared at the contents. His lips moved without sound. Then, finally, he whispered, "I found myself," and broke. He folded inward, clutching the box, sobbing like a man who had just remembered every pain he'd ever carried across lifetimes. Elle knelt beside him, her hands hovering helplessly. "Lucas, what is this? What does it mean?" Before he could answer, a new voice emerged from the darkness. "It means the dead don't stay buried forever." Startled, Elle turned. A tall, older man stood just beyond the trellis. Framed by the moonlight, he wore a coat too elegant for midnight visits and held a cane not for support, but ceremony. "Who are you?" Elle demanded, rising to her feet. He stepped closer. The resemblance to one of the portraits in the upstairs hallway was unmistakable. "Henry de Marais," he said. "My great-grandfather was your great-grandmother's husband." Elle's breath caught. Henry, the name had been mentioned only briefly in her grandmother's letters, as a man of pride and status. Protective to a fault. Henry glanced at the open box. Then at Lucas. There was no shock in his expression, only resignation. Louis was the gardener, Henry said. He loved her, and she was willing to throw everything away for him. My great-grandfather found out. They argued in this garden. There was a struggle. He claimed it was an accident. But, Henry looked down. He buried him here, told no one, and then, just weeks later, your great-grandmother vanished. Lucas, still on his knees, whispered, "She never left. She followed me, through time, through death." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You don't believe that, do you, that you're him?" Lucas raised his gaze, and in that moment, something passed between him, ancient, unspoken. "I don't have to believe. I remember." Henry looked away, suddenly ashamed. "Our family kept the secret to protect our name. But it was never ours to keep." Lucas turned to Elle, his voice breaking. "You know now, you remember, you feel it, don't you, that we were something, once, and that we were broken?" Elle nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, and this time, I won't run, I won't leave you." He reached for her hand, and she took it, kneeling beside him in the earth. Henry backed away, silent, letting the garden hold its breath again. In the soil, under the roses, a truth had been unearthed. And with it, the start of something that refused to die. The moon cast long shadows across the garden as the three of them stood there, past, present, and promise, waiting to see what dawn might bring. 1 year later, the estate that once whispered secrets beneath rose-covered arches had been transformed. Elle, now a woman known across the region not just for her inheritance but for her endurance, opened the Beaumont estate to the public as a private historical garden and memory gallery. She called it, "the garden that remembers." Visitors came from cities and small towns alike, drawn by the rumors, the beauty, and the tragedy that lingered like perfume in the air. The centerpiece of the gallery was a large portrait that hung in the main hall. Painted in 1920, it featured a striking young man in a dark vest and tie, standing under a familiar arch of roses. It was the same face that now walked the grounds from time to time. Only older, more knowing, Lucas. Beside it was a second painting, new but hauntingly classical. Elle had commissioned it herself, a double portrait of her and Lucas, seated in the garden with their hands gently touching, posed precisely as in the older painting. The composition was eerily symmetrical. Time had folded in on itself. 2 moments, 2 lifetimes, were now one. Guests would often stop before the paintings and whisper, "They haven't aged a day." Elle never denied the observation. She would simply smile and say, "Some people never got to finish their story. We're just making sure it gets the ending it deserves." Lucas still lived with her, but he often left for weeks, sometimes longer, traveling to old estates, forgotten ruins, or antique shops in search of something he never quite explained. Elle didn't press him. She knew that pieces of a past life don't come all at once. They come in dreams, in déjà vu, in the ache of familiarity. One summer night, when the moon was high and the garden bathed in silver, Elle stood by the window. Down in the garden, Lucas was under the trellis again, dressed in a simple white shirt. His hair moved slightly with the breeze, and he stood still, as if waiting for someone, or saying goodbye. She rushed out, barefoot and breathless. "Lucas," she called, but he didn't turn. He raised a hand slowly, like a wave caught in slow motion. Then, as the mist thickened, he faded, not into the trees, but into the air itself, like memory dissolving into silence. The next morning, Elle found a letter on her pillow. It was in Lucas's handwriting. The ink was slightly smudged, like it had been written with trembling hands, or tears. "Elle, you gave me peace. You gave us a second ending. I was never meant to stay. I only came back to finish what time had stolen. I have been forgiven, and now I am free. Live the rest of this life for both of us, with everything I once was, and all I'll ever be. Louis." Elle cried then, not in despair, but in the fragile relief that comes with closure. She placed the letter in a glass case beside the old garden spade. And beneath it, the simple inscription, "You can bury a body, but not a bond." Years later, children would walk through the Beaumont estate with wide eyes, asking their parents, "Did the gardener really come back from the dead?" The adults would laugh awkwardly, unsure of how to answer. But Elle would sometimes sit by the rose arch and whisper, "He never left." Not really, because some portraits fade, but not the ones painted by love, and loss, and memory itself. Those, like ghosts, linger in the light,